Cole Maddox's voice cut through the evening air like a whip crack, his eyes burning into the giggling girls retreating down his dirt road. Behind him stood Rosie Carter, trembling, humiliated, sent to his ranch as a cruel joke. They'd laughed when they shoved her toward the angry rancher's property, certain he'd throw her out like garbage. But Cole didn't throw her out. What happened next turned mockery into legend, a story of two broken souls who refused to stay broken. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The afternoon sun hung low and merciless over the dusty crossroads of Bitter Springs, Colorado, baking the rutted main street until the air itself seemed to shimmer with malice. Inside the three-story boarding house that loomed at the edge of town like a judgmental matron, 18-year-old Rosie Carter pressed herself against the wall of the upstairs hallway, trying to become invisible. She had learned the art of invisibility over 3 years of living here, how to move through doorways without drawing attention, how to make herself small during meals, how to laugh quietly at jokes she didn't understand just to avoid becoming their target. But today, invisibility had failed her. "There she is!" Vera Hutchins' voice rang out like a bell announcing execution. "Come on, Rosie, we've got wonderful news!" Rosie's stomach dropped. Nothing good ever followed those words, not in this house. She turned slowly to face the group of girls gathered at the top of the stairs. 5 of them, all prettier, all thinner, all infinitely more confident than she could ever hope to be. Vera stood at their center, her red hair gleaming in the shaft of dusty sunlight from the hallway window, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "What news?" Rosie's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "We found you a job," Margaret Yates chimed in, clapping her hands together with theatrical enthusiasm. "Isn't that exciting? You're always complaining about needing more money for your board." This was true. Rosie was 3 weeks behind on her payments to Mrs. Hutchins, the boarding house matron who ruled her domain with an iron fist wrapped in lace doilies. Her meager wages from taking in mending barely covered food, let alone the room she shared with 2 other girls who made their disgust at her presence abundantly clear. "What kind of job?" Rosie asked carefully, searching their faces for the trap she knew was coming. "Ranch work," Vera announced, and the other girls erupted into barely suppressed giggles. "The Maddox Ranch, to be specific. He's looking for help with barn cleaning and general labor. It pays $2 a week plus meals." $2 a week. The words hung in the air like a lifeline Rosie was afraid to grab. That would cover her board and leave enough for a new pair of boots. Hers had holes worn through the soles that she'd been stuffing with newspaper for 2 months. "The Maddox Ranch?" Rosie repeated slowly. Even in her isolation, she'd heard of Cole Maddox. Everyone in Bitter Springs had heard of Cole Maddox. "You mean Cole Maddox? The angry rancher?" "The very same," Margaret said brightly, though her eyes glittered with something cruel. "Apparently he placed an advertisement in town yesterday. He needs help right away. We thought of you immediately. We told Mr. Henderson at the general store that you'd be perfect for it," added Sarah Clemens, the youngest of the group at 16, her pretty face arranged in an expression of helpful concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He said to have you walk out there this afternoon. The ranch is about 3 miles west, just past the creek bend." Rosie's mind raced. Cole Maddox had a reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. He'd arrived in Bitter Springs 5 years ago and purchased the struggling ranch on the outskirts of town, keeping entirely to himself. The few times he came into town for supplies, people gave him a wide berth. There were stories, always stories, that he'd killed a man in Texas, that he'd gone mad with grief after losing his family, that he had a temper like a rattlesnake and twice as much venom. "I don't know," Rosie said quietly, already feeling the weight of their disappointment crushing down on her. "Maybe I should talk to Mrs. Hutchins first." "We already talked to Mrs. Hutchins," Vera interrupted, her voice taking on an edge of impatience. "She thinks it's a wonderful opportunity. In fact, she said if you don't take it, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. She can't keep carrying you when you're behind on payments." The trap snapped shut. Rosie felt it like a physical thing, steel jaws closing around her ankle. She looked from face to face, seeing the barely contained amusement, the way they leaned toward each other like conspirators sharing a delicious secret. They were lying, or if not lying entirely, then twisting the truth into something that served their entertainment. She could see it in the way Vera's smile didn't quite mask the gleam of anticipation in her eyes, the way Margaret kept glancing at the others as if checking that they were all still committed to whatever game this was. But what choice did she have? "All right," Rosie heard herself say, her voice hollow. "I'll go this afternoon." The girls exploded into squeals and exclamations, suddenly surrounding her like a flock of predatory birds. "Oh, how wonderful! You'll do so well! Wear your nicest dress! Tell us everything when you get back!" Their hands patted her arms, her shoulders, their voices bright with false encouragement. Rosie stood in the center of their attention like a specimen pinned to a board, knowing with absolute certainty that she was walking into something terrible, but unable to see any way around it. Well, 2 hours later, Rosie trudged along the rutted wagon path that led west out of town, her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had belonged to her mother, clinging to her back with sweat. The afternoon sun beat down without mercy, and the 3 miles might as well have been 30. Her worn boots raised small clouds of dust with each step, and she clutched a small bundle containing a change of clothes and her few precious possessions. A brush that had been her grandmother's, a small Bible with her name inscribed inside, and a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. They died of typhoid when she was 15, leaving her with nothing but debts and a ticket west to live with an aunt who'd turned out to be far less welcoming than the letters had promised. When the aunt died 2 years later, Rosie had found herself truly alone, working whatever job she could find and living in the cheapest boarding house in town. The boarding house girls' cruelty hadn't started immediately. At first, they'd simply ignored her, the heavy girl with the worn dresses and the quiet voice who never seemed to have money for the social events they all attended. But ignored had gradually transformed into target, especially after Rosie had caught the brief attention of a young clerk who'd been courting Vera. Nothing had come of it. The young man had lost interest as soon as Vera turned her considerable charms in his direction, but Vera had never forgotten and never forgiven. Now Rosie walked toward what she was increasingly certain was some sort of elaborate punishment, though she couldn't quite figure out what form it would take. Would Cole Maddox laugh at her, turn her away, or worse? The stories people told about him were contradictory and varied. Some said he was dangerous, others that he was simply bitter and broken. The most consistent detail was his temper. Everyone agreed that Cole Maddox had anger that could explode without warning, that he'd been known to shout at people in town for the smallest perceived slights, that his ranch hands never lasted more than a few weeks before they fled his rages, and they'd sent her to him. Soft, scared Rosie Carter, who flinched at loud noises and apologized for taking up space. The ranch came into view as she rounded a bend in the path, and Rosie's steps slowed. It was bigger than she'd expected, a sprawling property with a main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals. But even from a distance, she could see the signs of neglect. Fences sagged, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and weeds grew tall around the edges of the buildings. As she drew closer, she heard it, a man's voice, raised in fury. "God damn it! God damn it all to hell!" The cursing was punctuated by the sound of something heavy being thrown, then the splintering crash of wood breaking. Rosie froze on the path, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run back to town, to face Mrs. Hutchins' disappointment rather than whatever waited ahead. But she thought of the rent she owed, the holes in her boots, the way Vera had smiled when she'd announced this opportunity. Running back would prove them right, that she was useless, helpless, worthy only of mockery. So Rosie squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked forward. The source of the commotion was immediately visible as she entered the ranch yard. A wagon stood near the barn, its rear axle broken and one wheel tilted at a sickening angle. Tools lay scattered in the dust around it, and beside the wreckage stood Cole Maddox. He was bigger than she'd expected, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms corded with muscle visible beneath his rolled-up shirt sleeves. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, falling nearly to his shoulders, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his face that stopped her breath. Not because it was cruel or frightening, but because it was set in lines of such profound frustration and exhaustion that it almost hurt to look at. He stood with his hands braced on his hips, staring at the broken wagon, as if he could will it back together through sheer force of anger. He didn't notice her approach until she was perhaps 20 feet away and her shadow fell across the dust. Cole's head snapped up, and Rosie found herself pinned by the most intense gaze she'd ever encountered. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over water, and they swept over her in a single assessing glance that seemed to catalog everything: her worn dress, her nervous posture, the way she clutched her bundle to her chest like a shield. "What?" The single word came out harsh, sharp enough to make her flinch. I'm here about the job," Rosie managed, hating the tremor in her voice. "The barn cleaning position?" Cole's expression shifted from frustration to confusion to something that might have been suspicion. He straightened slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. "What job?" The advertisement?" Rosie felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the trap revealing itself in pieces. "Mr. Henderson at the general store said you needed help with barn work. The girls at the boarding house said, I didn't place any advertisement." Cole's voice was flat now, carefully controlled. "And I'm not hiring." The world tilted. Rosie felt heat flood her face, shame and humiliation mixing with a surge of anger that surprised her with its strength. Of course there was no job. How could she have been stupid enough to believe them? They'd sent her out here as a joke, probably already laughing about it back at the boarding house, imagining her walking 3 miles in the heat only to be turned away by the infamous angry rancher. "I see." She forced the words past the tightness in her throat. "I apologize for disturbing you." She turned to leave, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to spill over. 3 miles back to town. 3 miles to walk back knowing they were probably watching from the boarding house windows, waiting to see her return. 3 miles to rehearse the apologies she'd have to make to Mrs. Hutchins, to figure out where she'd go when she was thrown out onto the street. "Wait!" The command stopped her mid-step. She turned back slowly, afraid to hope. Cole was studying her again, but his expression had shifted into something more thoughtful. He gestured toward the broken wagon with one calloused hand. "You walk all the way out here from town?" "Yes, sir." "In this heat?" "Yes, sir." "And nobody's coming to pick you up? You were planning to walk back too?" Rosie nodded, not trusting her voice. Cole muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse or might have been a prayer. He looked at the broken wagon, then at the barn with its sagging door, then back at Rosie's face. She watched the calculations happening behind his eyes, watched him weighing options she couldn't begin to guess at. "You ever clean a barn before?" he asked finally. I've done stable work when I was younger, before my parents died. It's hard work, dirty work, and it needs to be done right, not halfway." "I understand." "I can't pay you much. $1 a day plus a meal at noon. If you work out, maybe we can talk about more." Hope fluttered in Rosie's chest, fragile as a bird with a broken wing. "You're offering me the job?" "I'm offering you a chance to prove you can do the job." Cole's voice remained gruff, but something in his eyes had softened almost imperceptibly. 1 week. If you can clean out that barn, and I mean really clean it, not just push the shit around, then we'll talk about keeping you on. But I need to see you can work, and I need to see you won't quit when it gets hard." "I won't quit." The words came out stronger than she'd intended, carrying the weight of every humiliation she'd endured, every cruel laugh she'd swallowed, every night she'd cried herself to sleep in that cramped boarding house room. Cole's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time, something that might have been approval flickered across his weathered face. "All right then. You can start tomorrow morning. Be here at first light." He paused, then added, "You got a way to get back to town today? I'll walk." "It's near 5 miles by the time you get back to the boarding house." "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, the broken wagon between them like a piece of shattered hope waiting to be reassembled. Then Cole nodded once, sharply. "Tomorrow, first light. Don't be late." "I won't, thank you, Mr. Maddox." "Just Cole." He turned back to the wagon, dismissing her. "Nobody calls me mister." Rosie clutched her bundle and started back down the path, her legs already aching from the walk out. But despite the exhaustion, despite the long walk home ahead of her, despite knowing what awaited her at the boarding house, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe something close to it. By the time Rosie stumbled through the boarding house door, the sun had set and her feet had gone beyond pain into numbness. The skin on the back of her neck felt burned despite the bonnet she'd worn, and every muscle in her legs screamed with each step up the stairs to the third floor. She could hear them before she saw them. The girls gathered in Vera's room, their laughter spilling out into the hallway like poison gas. Rosie considered trying to slip past unnoticed, but her room was right next to Vera's, and the floorboards creaked. They'd know she was back. "Rosie," Vera's voice called out sweetly. "Is that you? Come tell us about your new job." There was no avoiding it. Rosie set down her bundle and pushed open Vera's door. All 5 girls were there, arranged around the room in poses of casual elegance. Vera at her vanity, Margaret and Sarah sharing the settee, the other 2 perched on the edge of the bed. They turned to look at her with expressions of bright, false interest. "Well?" Vera asked, spinning around on her vanity stool. "How was Mr. Maddox? Did he hire you on the spot?" "He offered me a week's trial," Rosie said quietly, "starting tomorrow." The room fell silent. The girls exchanged glances, and Rosie saw something flicker across their faces. Surprise, quickly masked by renewed amusement. "A week's trial," Margaret repeated, her voice climbing with false enthusiasm. "How wonderful! What will you be doing?" "Cleaning the barn." "The barn," Vera echoed, and this time she didn't bother to hide her smile. "How fitting. And you'll be walking out there every day?" "Yes." "In the heat?" "Yes." "To clean out horse shit." This came from Sarah, who dissolved into giggles as soon as the crude words left her mouth. "To work," Rosie corrected, keeping her voice level despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath her exhaustion. "To earn money, which I need, as you all know." "Oh, we're not judging," Vera said quickly, though her tone suggested precisely the opposite. "It's honest work. Hard work, certainly, and dirty work, but honest. We're very proud of you for being willing to humble yourself that way." The words were designed to cut, and they did. But Rosie had endured 3 years of their subtle and not-so-subtle cruelties. She'd developed a thick skin, even if that skin sometimes felt about as protective as tissue paper. "I should rest," she said simply. "I need to be up before dawn." "Of course," Margaret said. "You'll need your strength for all that shoveling." More giggles followed Rosie as she retreated to her own room, closing the door behind her with careful control when what she wanted to do was slam it hard enough to rattle the windows. She sank down onto the narrow bed she shared with 2 other girls, neither of whom was present, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day. They'd sent her out there as a joke. That much was clear now. They'd probably expected Cole to throw her off his property, or they'd hoped he'd humiliate her in some way that would provide entertainment for weeks to come. The fact that he'd actually offered her work, that seemed to have surprised them almost as much as it had surprised her. But they weren't giving up on their fun. The way they'd laughed about the barn work, the way they'd emphasized the crude nature of the labor, they were already preparing the next round of mockery. She'd be the girl who shovels horse shit now, one more reason to exclude her from their circle, one more detail to highlight how far beneath them she was. Rosie lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling. Her body ached. Her pride ached worse. But underneath the pain and humiliation, that strange new feeling still flickered. She had a job. A real job, with real money, that would let her catch up on her rent and maybe even save enough to find somewhere else to live eventually. And more than that, Cole Maddox had looked at her, really looked at her, and he hadn't seen a joke. He'd seen someone who'd walked 6 miles in the heat and was still standing. He'd seen someone who wouldn't quit. Tomorrow, she'd prove him right. Rosie woke in darkness to the sound of the rooster's crow carrying up from the neighbor's yard. Her roommates still slept, one snoring softly, the other curled into a tight ball at the far edge of their shared bed. She dressed quickly in the dim pre-dawn light, choosing her oldest work dress and the boots with newspapers stuffed in the soles. Her hands trembled slightly as she braided her hair, and she had to start over twice before she got it right. The boarding house was silent as she crept down the stairs, though she could hear Mrs. Hutchins already moving around in the kitchen. Rosie considered stopping to explain where she was going, but decided against it. Let the girls tell their version first. Rosie would prove herself through actions, not words. The walk to the ranch seemed longer in the pre-dawn darkness, but also somehow easier. The air was cool and fresh, not yet baked by the sun, and the birds were beginning their morning songs in the trees along the path. By the time the ranch came into view, the sky was lightening to gray, then pink, then gold. Cole stood in the ranch yard, filling a bucket at the pump. He looked up as she approached, and something that might have been surprise crossed his face. "You came." "I said I would." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the barn. "Come on. I'll show you what needs doing." The barn was worse than she'd imagined. The interior was dim and stifling, the air thick with the smell of old manure, rotting hay, and something else, something sour and unpleasant that made her eyes water. The floor was covered in a layer of filth that looked to be months old, crusted and mixed with old bedding until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The walls were festooned with cobwebs, the support beams stained dark with age and neglect. "Previous hand quit about 2 months back," Cole said, his voice carefully neutral. "Haven't had time to deal with it myself, what with the fences needing mending and the well acting up and about 100 other things that take priority over a clean barn. I understand. Tools are there." He pointed to a corner where several shovels, rakes, and pitchforks leaned against the wall. "Wheelbarrows outside. There's a burn pile about 100 yards behind the barn. Anything that can't be composted goes there. Fresh hay's in the loft, but don't touch it until the floor's clean and dry. Questions?" Rosie looked around the barn again, trying to calculate how many hours, or days, this would take. The space was enormous, designed to hold at least a dozen horses plus storage for equipment and feed. Every surface was dirty. Every corner held years of accumulated neglect. "No questions," she said quietly. Cole's eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for signs of fear or doubt. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and headed for the door. "I'll be working on the north fence line if you need anything. There's a bell on the porch. Ring it if there's trouble." Then he was gone, and Rosie was alone with the dirtiest barn she'd ever seen in her life. For a long moment, she simply stood there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task. Then she thought of Vera's smile, of the girls' giggles, of the way they'd sent her out here expecting her to fail. She picked up a shovel and got to work. By noon, Rosie's hands were blistered and bleeding. She'd wrapped them in strips torn from her spare petticoat, but the rough wood of the shovel handle still found ways to rub against raw flesh with every movement. Her back ached from bending and lifting. Her shoulders burned from carrying load after load of filth in the wheelbarrow out to the burn pile, and sweat had soaked through her dress until it clung to her body like a second skin. But the floor of the barn was beginning to emerge. She'd cleared perhaps a quarter of the space, working methodically from the entrance toward the back, scraping away years of accumulated waste until she reached bare dirt. It wasn't clean yet. She'd need water and a stiff brush for that. But at least it was clear. "You planning to work straight through without eating?" Rosie jumped at the sound of Cole's voice. He stood in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the bright noon sun, watching her with an unreadable expression. I didn't want to stop," she admitted, wiping sweat from her forehead with her aching forearm. "There's so much to do." "Come on." He turned without waiting for a response. "Food's getting cold." The meal was simple: bread, cold beef, cheese, and water, but Rosie ate like it was a feast. Cole sat across from her at the rough wooden table on his porch, eating his own food in silence, occasionally glancing at her hands with their improvised bandages. "You should have said something," he said finally, nodding toward her hands. "I've got proper bandages in the house." "I didn't want to bother you." "It's not bothering me to keep you from crippling yourself on the first day." He stood, disappeared into the house, and returned with a small box containing clean cloth strips and a tin of some kind of salve. "Here, wrap them properly." Rosie unwound her makeshift bandages, wincing as the cloth stuck to the raw places. Cole watched with a critical eye as she applied the salve, something that smelled of herbs and stung like fire, and rewrapped her hands in the clean strips. "Better," he said when she was finished. "You'll get calluses eventually, but until then, you need to protect the skin." "Thank you." They ate in silence for a while longer. Then Cole spoke again, his voice careful, as if approaching something fragile. Those girls from the boarding house. They sent you out here as some kind of joke, didn't they? Rosie's hand stilled on her bread. She'd known he was smart enough to figure it out, but having it said aloud made the humiliation fresh again. Yes, she said quietly. Why? It was such a simple question, but it held so much. Why had they done it? Why had they chosen her? Why had she let them? Because they could, Rosie said finally. Because I'm easy to laugh at. Because I needed the work badly enough that I'd walk into whatever trap they set. Cole was silent for a long moment. When she dared to look up at him, his face was set in hard lines, but his eyes held something that might have been understanding. And yet you came anyway, he said, knowing it might be a joke. I didn't have much choice. There's always a choice. You could have told them to go to hell. And then what? Where would I go? What would I do? Rosie heard her voice rising and tried to pull it back down. I'm 3 weeks behind on my rent. I have no family, no prospects, no skills except mending and cleaning. When someone offers you a chance, even a cruel joke of a chance, you take it, because the alternative is the street. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, in a way she hadn't intended. She waited for him to tell her to leave, to say he didn't need someone so desperate, so pathetic. Instead, Cole nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then you'll stay until the work is done. No jokes, no tricks. You work hard, I pay fair. Deal? Deal. And those girls? His voice hardened. They come out here again. You let me know. There was something in his tone that made Rosie look up sharply. Cole's expression had shifted into something darker, something that reminded her why people in town called him angry. I can handle them, she said quietly. Maybe, but you shouldn't have to. He stood, gathering up the empty plates. Take a few more minutes, then back to work. And drink more water. I don't need you passing out in my barn from heat stroke. The afternoon seemed to stretch on forever. The sun climbed higher, turning the barn into an oven, and even with the doors open at both ends, the air barely moved. Rosie worked with grim determination, ignoring the pain in her hands, the ache in her back, the way her vision sometimes swam at the edges. She'd never worked this hard in her life. The mending she did at the boarding house was precise but light work, requiring more patience than strength. This was something entirely different, brutal, physical labor that tested every limit she had and then demanded more. But something strange was happening. As she cleared more of the barn floor, as she watched the piles of filth disappear and the space transform from disaster to something approaching functional, she felt pride. Real pride, in a way she'd never experienced from making neat stitches in someone else's dress. This was something she could see, something tangible and real. Every shovelful of waste removed, every square foot of floor cleared. It was proof that she existed, that she could change things, that she mattered. Late in the afternoon, Cole appeared in the doorway again. Rosie looked up from where she was using a rake to scrape at a particularly stubborn patch of crusted manure, expecting him to tell her it was time to quit for the day. Instead, he just stood there, looking around the barn with an expression she couldn't quite read. You've cleared half of it, he said finally. Is that good? It's better than I expected. He walked further into the barn, examining her work with a critical eye. You missed a spot there in the corner, and you'll need to get at that stuff between the boards more thoroughly. But yeah, it's good. The praise was simple, almost grudging, but it warmed something in Rosie's chest that had been cold for a very long time. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. You've still got half a barn to go, and then the real work starts, scrubbing, disinfecting, relaying the stall bedding. But his tone wasn't harsh. If anything, it was almost encouraging. I'll get it done, Rosie said, and realized she meant it. Cole looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you will. Come on, sun's getting low. Time to head back. I can keep working. No. The word was firm, but not unkind. You've done enough for one day, more than enough. And you need to rest if you're going to be worth anything tomorrow. He waited while she gathered her belongings, then walked with her to the edge of his property, where the path to town began. Same time tomorrow? He asked. Yes, I'll be here. Rosie. He waited until she looked up at him. You did good work today. Real work. Don't let anyone tell you different. The words stayed with her all the way back to town, through the gathering dusk, past the point where her legs trembled with exhaustion and her feet burned in her worn boots. When she finally stumbled through the boarding house door, she found the girls waiting in the front parlor, their faces bright with anticipation. "Rosie," Vera called out, "come tell us about your day. How was your first day shoveling shit?" The other girls giggled, but Rosie heard the edge of uncertainty in their laughter. They'd expected her to quit, to come back defeated and humiliated. Instead, she stood in the doorway covered in dirt and sweat, her hands bandaged, her dress ruined, and she was smiling. "It was hard work," she said simply, "but I'll be going back tomorrow." She walked past them toward the stairs, leaving them staring after her in confused silence. Behind her, she heard Vera's voice, sharp with irritation. "Well, I suppose some people enjoy wallowing in filth." But even that couldn't touch her, because for the first time in 3 years, Rosie Carter had done something that mattered. And tomorrow, she'd do it again. The week that followed established a rhythm that Rosie's body both hated and adapted to with surprising speed. Every morning she rose before dawn and made the walk to the ranch. Every day Cole was already awake, already working on some project or another, and every day she returned to the barn and continued the seemingly endless task of cleaning. By the 3rd day, her hands had developed the beginnings of calluses. By the 5th, she could lift and carry the heavy wheelbarrow without her arms shaking. By the 7th, the barn floor was completely clear, scraped down to bare dirt, and she was ready to begin the next phase. Scrubbing. Cole provided buckets, brushes with stiff bristles, and several large cakes of harsh lye soap that made her eyes water. The work was somehow even harder than the clearing had been, spending hours on her hands and knees scrubbing at stains that had set in for years, her shoulders burning with each circular motion. But the transformation was remarkable. As the dirt and stains slowly lifted away, the barn revealed itself to be actually beautiful underneath all the neglect. The wood of the stalls was good quality pine, aged to a warm honey color. The floor, once thoroughly scrubbed, became packed earth that smelled clean and fresh. Even the cobwebs, once swept away and the corners cleaned, revealed strong timber construction that would last for decades more. Cole watched her progress with what seemed like cautious approval. He didn't praise her often, he wasn't that kind of man, but occasionally she'd look up to find him standing in the doorway, observing her work with something that might have been respect in his eyes. The lunches on the porch became a routine she looked forward to. Cole wasn't much of a conversationalist, but his silence was different from the boarding house girl's pointed exclusion. His was the comfortable silence of someone who simply didn't waste words, who said things only when they needed saying. On the 8th day, as they shared bread and the last of a venison roast Cole had cooked the night before, he finally asked the question she'd been waiting for. "You planning to stay on? After the trial week?" Rosie's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. "If you'll have me. Barn's not done yet. Still needs fresh bedding laid, and then there's the tack room to sort through, and the loft could use organizing." He paused. "Could keep you busy for another few weeks at least." "I want to stay," Rosie said firmly. "As long as you'll let me." Cole nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. "All right then. $1 a day, plus lunch. And I'll throw in use of the small cabin out back. It's not much, just one room and a cook stove, but it's weatherproof. Better than walking 3 miles each way every day." "The cabin," Rosie repeated, not quite believing what she was hearing. "Like I said, it's not much. Previous hand used to stay there before he left. Hasn't been occupied in 2 months, so it'll need cleaning. But there's a bed frame and a table, and I can spare some blankets." He said it all matter-of-factly, as if offering her a place to live was no different than loaning her a rake. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes or no. Either way's fine." "Yes." The word came out in a rush. "Yes, absolutely yes." For the first time since she'd met him, Cole's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Good. You can move in whenever you're ready. Just let me know if you need help getting your things from town." That evening, Rosie walked back to the boarding house with her mind racing. A room of her own. A real job. The possibility of a future that didn't involve scrambling for rent money or dodging cruel jokes. It seemed almost too good to be true. She should have known it wouldn't be that simple. The explosion came the next morning as Rosie was packing her meager possessions into her cloth bundle. She told her roommates at breakfast that she'd be moving out, speaking the words quietly and without fanfare. But somehow, by the time she climbed the stairs to the third floor, the news had spread. Vera was waiting in the hallway, flanked by Margaret and Sarah. All three girls wore expressions of theatrical shock. "You're moving out?" Vera asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "To where exactly?" "The ranch," Rosie said evenly, trying to step around them. "Mr. Maddox has offered me accommodation there." "Accommodation." Vera repeated the word slowly, investing it with layers of insinuation. How generous of him! A single man, offering a young woman a place to live, on his property, where no one can see what happens. Rosie felt her face heat, but she kept her voice steady. "It's a cabin, a separate building, where his previous ranch hand lived." "Oh, I'm sure that's what he told you," Margaret chimed in, her pretty face arranged in an expression of pity. "Rosie, you can't be that naive. Everyone in town knows what Cole Maddox is like." "Do they?" Rosie surprised herself with the sharpness in her voice. "Because from what I've seen, everyone in town knows rumors and stories. But I've worked for him for over a week now, and he's been nothing but respectful and fair." "For now," Vera said darkly. "But once you're living out there, miles from town, completely dependent on him," she trailed off meaningfully. "I appreciate your concern," Rosie said, forcing the words through gritted teeth, "but it's misplaced. Now, if you'll excuse me—" "Does Mrs. Hutchins know you're leaving?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Because you still owe her 3 weeks' rent." This stopped Rosie cold. She'd forgotten about the debt in her excitement over the job and the cabin. 3 weeks at $2 per week, $6 total. She had saved some from her first week's wages, but not enough to cover the full amount. "I'll pay her what I owe," Rosie said quietly. "When?" Vera pressed. "Because it seems rather convenient, doesn't it? Running off to live with a man just when your debts come due?" "I'm not running off. It certainly looks that way." Vera's voice had taken on a harder edge now, the false sweetness stripped away to reveal the cruelty underneath. "In fact, one might say it looks rather scandalous. A woman of loose character taking up with an angry, isolated man, living in sin, that's enough." The 3 words came from behind the girls, spoken in a voice Rosie had never heard from Mrs. Hutchins before. Cold, sharp, and utterly commanding. The boarding house matron stood at the top of the stairs, her gray hair perfectly coiffed, her expression like carved ice. "Vera, Margaret, Sarah, downstairs, now." The girls scattered like autumn leaves before a strong wind, muttering hasty "yes, ma'ams" as they fled. Mrs. Hutchins waited until they were gone, then turned her attention to Rosie. "Is it true? You're leaving us for employment at the Maddox Ranch?" "Yes, ma'am. He's offered me steady work and accommodation." "And the money you owe me?" Rosie swallowed hard. "I have $3 saved from my first week's wages. I can give you that now, and I'll bring the rest in 2 weeks when I've earned it. You have my word." Mrs. Hutchins studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded. "That will be acceptable. Bring me the money you have now, and we'll consider your account current pending the remainder." She paused, then added in a slightly softer tone, "Those girls have been unkind to you. I'm not blind, Miss Carter. Perhaps this change will be good for you." "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet." "And Rosie?" Mrs. Hutchins' expression hardened again. "Those girls may be foolish and cruel, but they're not entirely wrong about appearances. A young woman living alone on a man's property will be talked about. You understand that?" "I understand, but I don't have many choices, ma'am. And Mr. Maddox has been nothing but proper. See that it stays that way. I'd hate to see you fall from difficult circumstances into worse ones." An hour later, Rosie walked away from the boarding house for the last time, her bundle of belongings clutched in her arms, and her heart beating fast with a mixture of fear and excitement. Behind her, she heard Vera's voice carrying through an open window. "Absolutely shameless. Mark my words, she'll be ruined within a month." But Rosie didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the path ahead, on the future that was waiting at a ranch 3 miles outside of town, on a life that was finally Finally, her own. The cabin sat about 50 yards behind the main house, half hidden by a stand of cottonwood trees that provided shade in the afternoons. It was smaller than Rosie had imagined, perhaps 12 feet by 15, with a single window facing east and a door that hung slightly crooked on its leather hinges. The roof was sound, at least, made of split shingles that showed signs of recent repair, and someone had built a small covered porch that kept the rain off the entrance. Cole pushed open the door and stepped back to let her enter first. Like I said, it's not much. Rosie stepped inside and had to pause to let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was spare but functional. A narrow bed frame against one wall, a small table with two mismatched chairs, a pot-bellied stove in the corner with a length of pipe running up through the roof, and a few shelves mounted on the walls. The floor was rough planking, uneven in places but solid. Dust covered everything in a fine gray layer and cobwebs draped from the corners like tattered curtains. But it was hers. "It's perfect," she heard herself say, and meant it. Cole grunted, clearly skeptical of her assessment. He moved to the stove and opened its door, checking inside. "Flue's clear. Previous hand kept it in good working order, at least. I'll bring you some wood for the fire tonight. Gets cold out here after sundown, even in summer." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but you'll need it anyway." He crossed to the window and tested the shutter. "This sticks. I'll fix it tomorrow. And the door needs rehanging, but that can wait until after you get settled." Rosie set her bundle on the table, watching him move around the small space with the ease of someone who knew exactly what needed attention and what could be left alone. He'd changed since that first day when she'd arrived to find him cursing at the broken wagon, or maybe she'd just learned to see past the gruff exterior to the man underneath. "Cole," she said quietly, "why are you doing this? Really?" He stilled, his back to her, one hand resting on the window frame. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned, and his storm-gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You walked 6 miles in the heat because someone sent you out here as a joke," he said finally. "And then you came back the next day. And the day after that. You've worked harder in the past week than most men I've hired have worked in a month, and you've never once complained, not about the heat, not about the work, not about your hands bleeding." He paused. "People who work that hard deserve a fair chance. That's all this is." "Is it?" The question came out before she could stop it. Cole's expression shifted into something unreadable. What else would it be? Rosie thought of Vera's insinuations, of Mrs. Hutchins' warnings, of all the reasons a single man might offer a young woman a place to live. But looking at Cole now, seeing the honest confusion in his face, she felt ashamed for even considering them. "Nothing," she said. "Just thank you. For the fair chance." He nodded once, sharply, then headed for the door. "Get yourself settled. If you need anything from town, supplies, personal items, whatever, make a list. I go in for provisions every 2 weeks, and the next trip's in 3 days." After he left, Rosie stood alone in the center of her new home and slowly turned in a circle, taking it all in. Dust and cobwebs aside, it was more than she'd ever hoped for. A space that was entirely hers, where no one would mock her or make her feel small, where she could close the door and simply exist without apology. She set to work immediately, unable to contain her need to make the place livable. She swept the floors until no trace of dust remained, scrubbed the table and chairs with water she hauled from the pump by the main house, washed the single window until light streamed through clearly, and knocked down every cobweb she could reach. By the time the sun began to set, the cabin had transformed from abandoned to home. True to his word, Cole appeared just as dusk was falling, carrying an armload of split wood and a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Firewood," he said, stacking it neatly beside the stove. "Should last you a few days, and I brought some extra blankets. Nights can get cold." He set the cloth bundle on the freshly scrubbed table, then seemed to hesitate before adding, "There's also some bread and preserves in there, and coffee. Figured you might want something to eat without having to walk up to the main house." "Cole, I can't keep taking things from you. You're not taking anything. It's part of your wages." But his tone suggested the subject wasn't open for debate. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start on the tack room." He was gone before she could form a proper thank you, his long strides carrying him back toward the main house through the gathering darkness. Rosie watched him go, then unwrapped the bundle to find not just bread and preserves, but also butter, a small tin of tea, 2 apples, and a wedge of cheese that looked like it had come from the general store in town. She made herself a simple dinner, lit the fire in the stove to ward off the evening chill, and sat at her table eating food she hadn't begged for or scrimped to afford. Through the window, she could see a light glowing in the main house where Cole moved about in his evening routine. The ranch was quiet, except for the occasional sound of horses shifting in their corral and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. For the first time in 3 years, Rosie Carter went to sleep without fear of tomorrow. And when she closed her eyes on her narrow bed wrapped in Cole's borrowed blankets, she dreamed not of boarding house cruelties, but of clean barns and honest work, and a man with storm cloud eyes who'd given her a chance when no one else would. The peaceful night made what came next feel like even more of a violation. She woke to the sound of laughter, high, feminine, and deliberately loud. Disoriented, Rosie sat up in bed, trying to place the sound. Dawn light was just beginning to filter through her window, which meant it was barely past 5 in the morning. Who would be out here at this hour? The laughter came again, followed by voices she recognized with a sinking feeling in her stomach. Can't believe she actually moved out here, living in that tiny shack, probably already warming his bed. Rosie was on her feet and out the door before she'd fully processed the decision to move. The scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. Vera, Margaret, and Sarah stood in the ranch yard between the cabin and the main house, all dressed in their finest day dresses as if they'd come to pay a social call. But their expressions held nothing social or kind. Vera held a parasol she was using to gesture toward the cabin with theatrical disdain, while Margaret had produced a handkerchief and was holding it delicately to her nose as if the very air of the ranch offended her. "Oh, look," Vera said brightly as Rosie emerged. "The mistress of the house awakens." "What are you doing here?" Rosie's voice came out steadier than she felt. "We came to see how you were settling in," Margaret said with false sweetness. "After all, we're so worried about you. All alone out here with that dangerous man." "He's not dangerous, and I'm not alone. I'm working." Rosie crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly aware that she was still in her nightdress with her hair loose around her shoulders. "You need to leave." "Leave? But we've only just arrived." Sarah's voice held that same edge of cruelty that Rosie had learned to recognize. "We wanted to see what could possibly make you choose this." She gestured around the ranch with undisguised contempt. "Over the comforts of town." "The comforts of town," Rosie repeated slowly. "Where I slept 3 to a bed and went hungry more often than not? Where I was mocked every single day? Those comforts." Vera's expression hardened. "At least in town you had your reputation. Out here, living with a man everyone knows has a terrible temper, refusing to attend church or socialize with decent people." She lowered her voice to a stage whisper that was clearly meant to carry. "People are already talking, Rosie, saying you've become his mistress, his whore." The crude word hung in the morning air like a slap. Rosie felt her face burn, but before she could formulate a response, a new voice cut through the tension. "You want to say that again?" Cole had emerged from the main house without any of them noticing, and he moved across the yard with a purposeful stride that made all 3 girls take an involuntary step backward. He was dressed for work, his shirt sleeves already rolled up despite the early hour, and his expression was darker than Rosie had ever seen it. "Mr. Maddox!" Vera recovered quickly, arranging her features into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I heard what you were just doing." Cole came to stand beside Rosie, close enough that she could feel the anger radiating off him like heat from a forge. "You came onto my property at dawn to insult my employee and spread vicious lies about her character." "We were concerned for her welfare," Margaret began. "No, you weren't. You were concerned that she got away from you." Cole's voice was low and controlled, which somehow made it more menacing than if he'd shouted. "You sent her out here as a joke, expecting me to humiliate her. When I didn't, you've been waiting for a chance to punish her for it. Well, here's how this is going to work. You're going to leave my property right now, and you're not going to come back, ever. You can't forbid us from... This is my land. I can forbid anyone I damn well please." Cole took another step forward, and the girls retreated again. "And if I hear one more word, one single word about Miss Carter's reputation in town. I'll make it my personal business to visit each of your families and explain exactly how you've been spending your time. Trespassing, harassment, slander. I'm sure the good people of Bitter Springs will be fascinated to hear about it. The color drained from Vera's face. Whatever response she'd been preparing died on her lips as she seemed to recognize something in Cole's expression. Not just anger, but the kind of controlled fury that came from a man who decided he'd had enough and was prepared to follow through on every threat. "We were only trying to help," she said weakly. "By calling her a whore? That's your idea of help?" Cole's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Get off my property, now, before I lose what's left of my patience." The girls fled, their fine dresses kicking up dust as they hurried back toward their carriage, which Rosie now noticed waiting on the road. They climbed in with considerably less grace than they'd probably arrived with, and the driver, who'd been watching the entire scene with poorly concealed interest, snapped the reins immediately. Cole and Rosie stood side by side in the yard, watching until the carriage disappeared around the bend in the road. Then Cole turned to her, and some of the anger drained from his expression, replaced by concern. "You all right?" Rosie found herself shaking, not with fear, but with a complicated mixture of relief, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. Yes, thank you. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." His voice was firm. "You work for me, you live on my land, and that means you're under my protection. Anyone who wants to hurt you has to go through me first. That's just how it is." "But they called me." She couldn't bring herself to repeat the word. "They called you a lie. A vicious, cruel lie that says more about them than it does about you." Cole's jaw tightened. "You've done nothing wrong, Rosie. You took an honest job and you've worked harder than anyone has a right to expect. What happened just now? That's their shame, not yours." The words broke something open inside her chest, and to her horror, Rosie felt tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them away quickly, embarrassed by the display of emotion, but they kept coming. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't—" "Hey!" Cole's voice softened in a way she'd never heard before. "Hey, it's all right. You're allowed to cry. God knows you've earned the right." But she couldn't seem to stop. 3 years of swallowed hurt, 3 years of cruel jokes and small humiliations, 3 years of making herself small and quiet and invisible. It all came pouring out in great gasping sobs that she couldn't control. She covered her face with her hands, mortified but unable to stop, and then she felt Cole's hand rest gently on her shoulder. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you inside." He guided her back into the cabin and sat her down at the table, then busied himself with lighting the fire in the stove and putting water on to heat. Rosie tried to compose herself, wiping at her face with her sleeve and taking deep, shuddering breaths. "I'm sorry," she said again when she could finally speak. "I didn't mean to fall apart like that." "You didn't fall apart. You cried. There's a difference." Cole poured hot water into a tin cup and added something from a small bottle he'd pulled from his pocket. "Here, drink this." "What is it?" "Tea with a bit of whiskey. It'll steady your nerves." Rosie accepted the cup and took a cautious sip. The liquid burned going down but left a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the alcohol. Cole pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her, his long legs stretched out under the small table. "They've been like that since I arrived," Rosie said quietly, staring into her cup. "The girls at the boarding house. At first they just ignored me, but then it got worse. Little cruelties every day, hiding my things, accidentally spilling ink on my dresses, making sure I was left out of any social activities. And the jokes. Always the jokes about my weight, my clothes, my circumstances. Why didn't you leave? Where would I go? I had no money, no family, no skills that would get me hired anywhere decent." She took another sip of the fortified tea. "The boarding house was the cheapest place in town. I thought if I could just be quiet enough, small enough, invisible enough, they'd eventually lose interest and leave me alone. But they didn't. No, they didn't." Rosie looked up and met his eyes. "That's why they sent me out here, you know. They thought you'd throw me out, or humiliate me, or I don't know. Whatever they imagined, it was supposed to be funny, another joke at Fat Rosie's expense." Cole's expression darkened again. "I'm not much for jokes." "I noticed." Despite everything, she felt a small smile tugging at her lips. You terrified them just now. I don't think anyone's ever stood up for me like that before. Then people haven't been doing their job. He stood and moved to the door, pausing with one hand on the frame. Get yourself together, then come up to the main house for breakfast. Real breakfast. Eggs, bacon, the works. You need something substantial after a morning like this. Cole? She waited until he turned back. Why are you being so kind to me? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, the rising sun behind him turning his edges to gold, and for a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with some emotion she couldn't identify. Because someone should be, he said simply. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her cooling tea and the realization that something had shifted between them, something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond landlord and tenant, into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. Rosie finished her tea, washed her face in the basin she'd filled the night before, and dressed in her work clothes with hands that still trembled slightly. By the time she made her way up to the main house, the sun had fully risen and the ranch was coming alive with the sounds of morning, chickens clucking in their coop, horses whinnying for their breakfast, a rooster crowing his belated announcement of dawn. The main house was larger than she'd expected from the outside, and when Cole invited her in, she found herself in a kitchen that was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's home. The floor was swept, the dishes were clean and stacked on open shelves, and a large table dominated the center of the room. Sit, Cole ordered, already moving to the stove where a pan was heating. How do you like your eggs? However you're making them is fine. That's not what I asked. Scrambled then, please. She watched as he cooked with the same competence he brought to everything else. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Within minutes, he'd placed a plate in front of her loaded with scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, and bread toasted over the stove. Her stomach growled loudly at the sight. When's the last time you had a proper meal? Cole asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. I ate yesterday. I mean a proper meal. Meat, eggs, vegetables. Real food, not just bread and cheese. Rosie thought about it and realized she couldn't remember. A while, she admitted. Cole muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. From now on, you eat breakfast and lunch here. Dinner, too, if you want. I'm not having you waste away while you're working yourself to the bone on my property. I can't keep taking. It's not taking. It's part of your employment. He fixed her with a look that brooked no argument. You work hard. You need fuel. That's just common sense. Now eat before it gets cold. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. The food was simple but delicious, and Rosie found herself eating more than she'd intended, her body craving the sustenance it had been denied for so long. Can I ask you something? She said finally, pushing her empty plate away. Depends on the question. The stories people tell about you in town, about your temper, about being dangerous, are they true? Cole set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. I've got a temper, that's true enough, and I don't suffer fools or cruelty. If that makes me dangerous, then I suppose the stories are accurate. But you're not. She struggled to find the right words. You're not cruel. You've been nothing but fair with me. There's a difference between being angry and being cruel, Cole said quietly. I learned that difference the hard way. My father. He stopped, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. Let's just say I know what real cruelty looks like. And I made a choice a long time ago that I wouldn't become that kind of man. What happened to make you so angry, though, if you don't mind me asking? Cole was silent for so long that Rosie thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out over his ranch with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I had a family once, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. A wife, a daughter. Sarah was 4 years old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh. We lived in Texas, had a small ranch outside of Austin. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. He paused, and Rosie saw his shoulders tense. There was a fever that went through the area, started in town and spread fast. By the time we realized how bad it was too late. They were both gone within a week. Oh, Cole. Rosie's hand went to her mouth. I'm so sorry. That was 8 years ago. I sold the Texas ranch, couldn't stand to be there anymore with all those memories. Drifted for a while, worked other people's land, got into some fights I shouldn't have. That's where the stories come from, the fights, the drinking, the anger at everything and everyone. He turned back to face her, and his expression was raw in a way that made her chest ache. Eventually, I ended up here, bought this place, figured I'd work myself into the ground and not have to think anymore. And for the most part, it's worked. The anger's still there, but I've learned to channel it into something productive. Is that why you don't go into town much? Why you keep to yourself? Partly. Also because people look at a man who's lost everything, and they either pity him or fear him. I don't have patience for either. He crossed his arms over his chest. So yes, the stories are true. I've got a temper, and I've done things I'm not proud of. But I've never hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and I've never turned away someone who needed help. That's the best I can offer. Rosie stood and crossed to where he stood by the window. Without overthinking it, she reached out and touched his arm, a brief, gentle contact that made him look down at her in surprise. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. And thank you for helping me, even though I was sent here as a joke. Especially because you were sent here as a joke. Cole's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Come on, we've got work to do, and wallowing in the past won't get the tack room sorted. The rest of the day passed in the familiar rhythm of hard work. The tack room, attached to the barn, was a disaster of tangled leather, rusty metal, and accumulated junk that previous ranch hands had apparently just thrown in rather than properly storing. Rosie and Cole worked side by side, sorting through bridles and halters, testing leather for rot, polishing buckles, and organizing everything onto the hooks and shelves that lined the walls. As they worked, Cole told her stories about his horses, their personalities, their quirks, the trouble they sometimes caused. His voice lost its hard edge when he talked about the animals, becoming almost gentle, and Rosie found herself relaxing in his company in a way she hadn't relaxed around another person in years. That bay mare, Juniper, I call her, she's smart as a whip but stubborn as hell, Cole said, holding up a bridle with a broken cheek piece. Through 3 different ranch hands before I figured out she just needed someone to ask her nicely instead of telling her what to do. Sounds like a reasonable preference, Rosie said with a small smile. Most reasonable creatures appreciate being asked instead of ordered around. Cole glanced at her meaningfully. Present company included. They worked through the afternoon, taking a brief break for lunch on the porch where they'd shared so many meals already. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally finished the tack room. Every piece of leather cleaned and oiled, every buckle polished, everything organized and properly stored. Cole stood in the doorway surveying their work with an expression of satisfaction. Good job. Real good job. Between this and the barn, the place is starting to look like an actual working ranch again instead of a disaster site. It feels good, Rosie admitted, seeing the difference we've made. We? Cole turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised. This was 90% you. I just helped with the heavy lifting and the high shelves. You did more than that. You taught me how to tell good leather from bad, how to oil tack properly, how to organize things so they'd be easy to find. She brushed dust from her skirt. I've learned more in 2 weeks here than I learned in 3 years at the boarding house. That's not saying much, considering what they were teaching you at the boarding house was how to be cruel for entertainment. It was perhaps the most judgmental thing she'd heard him say about anyone, and the fierce protectiveness in his voice made something warm bloom in her chest. Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road. A single rider was approaching, a man in his middle years wearing the dusty clothes of someone who'd been traveling. As he drew closer, Rosie saw his face break into a wide grin. "Cole Maddox, you old son of a gun!" Cole's entire demeanor transformed. The hard lines of his face softened into something approaching joy, and he strode forward to meet the rider as he dismounted. "Henry Walsh, what in God's name are you doing in Bitter Springs?" "Passing through on my way to Denver. Thought I'd stop and see how you were getting on with this place." The man called Henry clapped Cole on the shoulder, then his gaze slid to Rosie with obvious curiosity. "And who's this?" "This is Miss Rosie Carter. She works for me. Rosie, this is Henry Walsh, We worked together in Texas before. He trailed off, but Henry nodded in understanding. Before things went to hell, Henry finished gently. He turned to Rosie and tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Pleased to meet you, Miss Carter. Any woman who can put up with Cole's temperament deserves a medal. She's earned several in the past 2 weeks, Cole said dryly. Come on up to the house. You'll stay for dinner. I won't take no for an answer. As the two men walked toward the main house, still catching up, Rosie hung back slightly, uncertain of her place in this reunion. But Cole glanced over his shoulder and called back to her. That includes you, Rosie. Can't have Henry thinking I don't feed my workers properly. Dinner that evening was the liveliest meal Rosie had ever experienced on the ranch. Henry was a born storyteller, full of tales from his travels and memories of his time in Texas with Cole. For the first time, Rosie saw Cole truly laugh. Not just a slight quirk of his lips, but genuine, full-throated laughter that transformed his entire face. And then the pig got loose in the church during Sunday service. Henry slapped the table, tears of laughter streaming down his face. Cole here had to chase it up and down the aisles while the preacher kept trying to deliver his sermon like nothing unusual was happening. It wasn't my pig, Cole protested, though he was grinning. I was just trying to help. You caught it, though, tackled it right there in front of the altar, the look on Mrs. Henderson's face. They dissolved into laughter again, and Rosie found herself laughing along with them, caught up in the infectious joy of the story. It felt good to laugh, to be included in something light and happy after so many heavy days. As the laughter faded and they settled into comfortable silence, Henry turned his attention to Rosie with a more serious expression. So how did you end up working for this grumpy hermit, if you don't mind me asking? Rosie glanced at Cole, uncertain how much to share. He gave a slight nod, as if giving her permission to tell the story however she chose. I needed work, she said simply, and he needed help. There's more to it than that, Cole said quietly. He proceeded to tell Henry the whole story. The boarding house girls, the cruel joke, Rosie's determination despite knowing she'd been set up, the confrontation that morning. As he spoke, Rosie watched Henry's expression shift from curiosity to understanding to a kind of fierce approval. Well then, Henry said when Cole had finished, sounds like you found yourself a good one, Cole. Someone with spine and grit. Those are rare qualities. I know it, Cole said, looking at Rosie with an expression that made her heart skip. She's the best hand I've had in years. Works harder than most men twice her size and never complains. Takes one stubborn soul to work for another, Henry observed with a knowing smile. You two are well matched, I'd say. There was something in the way he said it, some implication that went beyond employment, that made Rosie's cheeks heat. But before she could stammer out a response, Cole was standing and clearing plates, effectively ending that line of conversation. Henry stayed late into the evening, swapping more stories with Cole, while Rosie listened from her place at the table. She learned things about the man she worked for that she never would have known otherwise. That he'd once been quick to smile, that he'd been known for his kindness to animals and children, that before tragedy had hardened him, he'd been the kind of man people naturally gravitated toward. When Henry finally declared he needed to get some sleep before continuing his journey in the morning, Cole walked him out to the barn where he'd be sleeping in the loft. Rosie began cleaning up the dinner dishes, her mind full of all she'd learned. She was elbow-deep in sudsy water when Cole returned, moving to stand beside her with a dish towel in hand. You don't have to help, she protested. I can finish this. I know I don't have to, but 4 hands work faster than 2. He began drying the plates she'd washed, working in comfortable silence for a moment before adding, Thank you for tonight, for being part of dinner. Henry's a good man, and it meant a lot having you there. I should thank you for including me, for letting me see. She trailed off, unsure how to finish. Letting you see what? That you're not just the angry rancher everyone in town thinks you are, that there's more to you than the stories suggest. Cole set down the plate he'd been drying and turned to face her fully. In the lamplight, his eyes were softer than she'd ever seen them, and when he spoke, his voice held a rawness that made her chest tighten. I'm not a good man, Rosie. I've done things, said things, that I can't take back. The anger is real, and it's always there, just under the surface. But I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to be better than I was, To be the kind of man Sarah would have been proud of. Your daughter. Yes. He smiled sadly. She was so little, but she had this way of looking at people, really seeing them, you know? She never judged anyone, never made anyone feel small. I want to be more like that, like she was. Without thinking, Rosie reached out and took his hand. His calluses were rough against her palm, his fingers strong and warm. I think you're doing better than you realize, she said softly. You gave me a job when I needed one, a place to live. You defended me against people who wanted to hurt me. That's not the behavior of a bad man, Cole. That's the behavior of someone who knows what it feels like to be hurt and refuses to inflict that pain on others. For a long moment, they stood there in the lamplight kitchen, hands clasped, something unspoken passing between them. Then Cole gently squeezed her fingers and stepped back, breaking the contact but not the connection. Get some rest, he said quietly. Tomorrow's another workday. What's left to do? We've cleaned the barn, organized the tack room. There's always something on a ranch, fences to mend, animals to tend, 100 small tasks that never seem to end. He smiled slightly. But maybe we can take it a bit easier tomorrow. You've earned a slower pace. Rosie walked back to her cabin through the darkness, guided by the light spilling from her window where she'd left a lamp burning. Behind her, she could see Cole still standing in the kitchen doorway, silhouetted against the warm light, watching to make sure she made it safely home. Home. The word resonated in her chest as she opened her cabin door and stepped inside. This was home now, not the boarding house with its cruelties and humiliations, but this simple space where she could be herself without apology. As she prepared for bed, Rosie thought about Cole's words, about his daughter, about the way his hand had felt in hers. Something was shifting between them, something that went beyond gratitude or respect into territory that made her heart race with equal parts excitement and fear. She was falling for him. Despite every warning she'd heard about the angry rancher, despite knowing that he was still grieving the family he'd lost, despite the fact that she'd only known him for 2 weeks, she was falling for Cole Maddox. And the most terrifying part was, she thought he might be falling for her too. The realization kept Rosie awake long into the night, staring at the rough-hewn beams of her cabin ceiling while her mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. What would happen if she acknowledged these feelings? What if Cole didn't feel the same way? Worse, what if he did, and the town's gossip turned from speculation to vindication? She'd already been called a whore once. If anything actually developed between them, the judgment would be merciless. But in the darkness of her small room, with only the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl for company, Rosie couldn't bring herself to regret the warmth that spread through her chest whenever she thought of Cole's rare smiles, his rough kindness, the way he'd stood between her and cruelty without hesitation. Henry left at dawn the next morning, clasping Cole's hand firmly and pulling him into a brief embrace that spoke of years of friendship and shared grief. Before mounting his horse, he made a point of seeking out Rosie where she stood on the porch of her cabin. Take care of him, Henry said quietly, low enough that Cole couldn't hear from where he was checking the horse's saddle. He's been alone too long, and loneliness can make a man forget he's still capable of living, not just surviving. I'm just his employee, Rosie protested weakly. Henry's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. If that's what you need to tell yourself, Miss Carter, but I've known Cole Maddox for 15 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you last night at dinner. He tipped his hat. Just don't give up on him too quickly. He's worth the effort. Then he was gone, riding east with a wave, leaving Rosie with a heart that felt too large for her chest and questions she didn't know how to answer. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost domestic in its comfort. Each morning, Rosie would wake before dawn and walk up to the main house where Cole already had coffee brewing and breakfast started. They'd eat together at his kitchen table, planning the day's work over scrambled eggs and thick slices of toast. Then they'd spend the day tackling whatever task the ranch demanded, mending fences, mucking out stalls, grooming horses, repairing the chicken coop's wire mesh, clearing brush from the irrigation ditches. The work was endless and exhausting, but Rosie found she didn't mind. Her body was changing, growing stronger. The softness of her arms gave way to visible muscle. Her hands developed thick calluses that protected her from blisters. She could lift and carry things that would have been impossible a month ago, and the walks to and from town that had once left her gasping for breath now barely winded her. Cole noticed, though he said nothing directly. Instead, she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read as she hefted a full water bucket or wrestled a bale of hay into position. There was approval in his eyes, certainly, but also something else, something that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken. They talked while they worked, sharing pieces of their pasts in the careful way of two people learning to trust. Rosie told him about her parents, about the happy childhood that had ended too soon, about the aunt who'd promised love and delivered only obligation. Cole shared memories of his daughter Sarah, her laughter, her fearlessness, the way she'd insisted on helping him with ranch work even when she was too small to actually be useful. She'd have been 12 now, Cole said one afternoon as they repaired a section of corral fencing. He held a post steady while Rosie hammered in nails, and his voice was distant, lost in memory. Already growing up, probably would have been interested in boys, much to my horror. You'd have been a protective father, Rosie observed, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. Damn right I would have. Any boy wanted to court my Sarah, he'd have to prove he was worthy of her. Cole's expression softened into sadness. But I don't get to be that. I don't get to see her grow up, don't get to teach her to ride properly or walk her down the aisle someday. All I've got are 4 years of memories and a world of what-ifs. Rosie set down her hammer and touched his arm gently. I'm sorry doesn't seem like enough to say, but I am. So deeply sorry. I know you are. Cole covered her hand with his own, the gesture brief but meaningful. That's the thing about grief, it never really goes away. You just learn to carry it. Some days it's heavier than others. Is today a heavy day? No. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her heart skip. Today is actually lighter than most. Having you here helps. Having someone to share the work, share meals, share conversation. It reminds me that I'm still alive, still capable of... He trailed off, seeming to catch himself before saying something he wasn't ready to voice. Capable of what? Rosie asked softly. Cole released her hand and turned back to the fence post, but not before she saw color rise in his weathered cheeks. Capable of giving a damn about something other than just getting through another day. They worked in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, heavy with things unsaid but understood. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, they moved on to checking the water troughs in the far pasture, walking side by side through grass that had turned golden in the summer heat. I need to make a trip into town tomorrow, Cole said as they worked. Need supplies from the general store, and I want to stop by the feed store to order winter hay. You're welcome to come along if you want. Might be good to get away from the ranch for a few hours. Rosie's immediate instinct was to refuse. Town meant the boarding house, meant potential encounters with Vera and her friends, meant facing the gossip that was surely circulating about her. But something in Cole's tone suggested the invitation was important to him, and she found she didn't want to disappoint him. All right, she agreed. I could use some new work gloves anyway. Mine are getting worn through at the fingertips. Cole's expression brightened almost imperceptibly. Good. We'll leave after breakfast. Fair warning, though, people will stare. Small towns being what they are, everyone's going to have an opinion about you working out here. Let them stare, Rosie said with more confidence than she felt. I'm not ashamed of honest work. That's the spirit. Cole's rare smile appeared, transforming his face. Besides, I'll be right there with you. Anyone wants to say something, they can say it to both of us. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed designed for optimism. Rosie dressed carefully, choosing her best remaining dress, a simple gray cotton that had belonged to her mother, and braiding her hair more neatly than usual. When she emerged from her cabin, Cole was already waiting by the wagon, the horses hitched and ready. He looked different too, she noticed. He'd trimmed his beard and combed his hair back, and he wore a clean shirt she'd never seen before. When he saw her, something flickered across his face that might have been appreciation. You look nice, he said simply. So do you. They smiled at each other for a moment, awkward as teenagers, before Cole cleared his throat and helped her up onto the wagon seat. The ride into town took about 40 minutes, and they spent it discussing the ranch, the upcoming harvest season, the new mare Cole was considering purchasing from a breeder in the next county. But as they approached Bitter Springs proper, Rosie felt her confidence beginning to waver. The main street was busy with morning activity. Shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, housewives with baskets heading to market, men gathered outside the saloon discussing business. And all of them, every single one, stopped to stare as Cole's wagon rolled past. "Steady," Cole murmured, keeping his eyes forward. "Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you squirm." He pulled the wagon up in front of Henderson's general store and came around to help Rosie down. His hand was warm and steady on her elbow, and he kept it there as they walked into the store together. A deliberate statement that they were a unit, that anyone who wanted to judge her would have to go through him first. The general store fell silent as they entered. Mr. Henderson stood behind the counter, his round face going through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, something that might have been disapproval. Behind him, his wife Martha emerged from the back room and stopped dead, her eyes widening. "Maddox," Mr. Henderson said after a beat. "What can I do for you?" "Need to place a large order," Cole said easily, pulling a list from his pocket. "Flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, and about a dozen other things. Miss Carter also needs new work gloves." The addition of Rosie's name to the order was deliberate, making it clear she wasn't just accompanying him, but was a legitimate part of his household with needs of her own. Mr. Henderson's eyes flickered between them, clearly trying to assess the nature of their relationship. "Work gloves," he repeated. "For the young lady." "Miss Carter works on my ranch," Cole said, his voice taking on an edge. "She needs proper equipment. You got a problem with that?" "No, no problem at all." Mr. Henderson moved quickly to gather the items, clearly unwilling to provoke Cole's temper. "I'll just gather these items." While he bustled around filling the order, Martha Henderson approached Rosie with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rosie Carter, we heard you'd left the boarding house. How are you finding life at the Maddox Ranch?" "I'm finding it very well, thank you," Rosie replied, keeping her voice level. "It must be quite different from town life. So isolated out there. Don't you get lonely?" The question was designed to probe, to extract information that could be turned into gossip. But before Rosie could formulate a response, Cole's voice cut through the tension. "She's got plenty of company. The work keeps us both busy from dawn to dusk." He appeared at Rosie's side, close enough that his arm brushed hers. "Now, about those gloves." The rest of the shopping trip proceeded in similar fashion, with curious stares following them at every stop. At the feed store, the proprietor asked pointed questions about why Cole suddenly needed help when he'd always worked alone before. At the hardware store, they encountered a group of women who fell silent as they passed, then erupted into whispers the moment they thought they were out of earshot. Through it all, Cole remained a steady presence at Rosie's side, his expression daring anyone to say something directly. And perhaps because of that, because he made it clear she was under his protection, no one did. The gossip would come later, Rosie knew, but for now they maintained a veneer of civility. They were loading their purchases into the wagon when a familiar voice called out across the street. "Well, well, if it isn't the happy couple." Vera stood on the sidewalk outside the millinery shop, flanked by Margaret and Sarah. All three were dressed in their finest, clearly making a social occasion of their shopping trip. Vera's smile was sharp as a knife. Cole's entire body went rigid, but Rosie put a hand on his arm before he could respond. "Let me handle this," she said quietly. She crossed the street to face the three girls, drawing on every ounce of strength she'd built over the past month. Up close, she could see that Vera looked slightly less confident than her bold greeting had suggested. There was uncertainty in her eyes, as if she wasn't quite sure how this confrontation would go. "Hello, Vera," Rosie said calmly. "Margaret, Sarah, lovely day for shopping." "Isn't it?" Vera's smile never wavered, but her eyes were calculating. "We've heard such interesting things about you lately. Living out at the Maddox Ranch, working as his, what did you call it? Employee." "That's exactly what I am. Mr. Maddox needed help with ranch work, and I needed employment. It's a straightforward arrangement." "How terribly convenient," Margaret chimed in. "And does this arrangement include him buying you pretty new dresses?" "Because that one looks almost respectable." "This dress belonged to my mother, and it's the same one I've worn for years, but thank you for noticing." Rosie kept her voice sweet, refusing to be baited. Is there something specific you wanted, or did you just feel like making uncomfortable implications on a public street? For the first time, Vera's confident facade cracked slightly. We're simply concerned about you, Rosie. Living alone with a man, miles from town with no proper chaperone. People are talking. Let them talk. Rosie straightened her shoulders, feeling stronger than she ever had in this town. I'm earning an honest living doing honest work. I have a roof over my head, food on my table, and I answer to no one but myself and my employer. That's more than I ever had at the boarding house. But your reputation, my reputation? Rosie's laugh was sharp and genuine. You three destroyed my reputation the day I arrived in this town. You made sure I was excluded, mocked, belittled at every opportunity. You sent me out to that ranch hoping I'd be humiliated. Well, here I am, thriving instead of suffering. So if you're looking for me to apologize for finding a better life, you're going to be waiting a very long time. She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and Vera? The next time you want to spread gossip about me, at least have the courage to say it to my face instead of hiding behind concerned citizenship. We both know you don't actually care about my welfare. Rosie walked back to the wagon where Cole waited, leaving the three girls staring after her in stunned silence. Cole's expression was a mixture of surprise and unmistakable pride. That was something, he said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. I'm tired of being afraid of them, Rosie replied, her hands shaking slightly with adrenaline. They've had power over me for too long. They don't anymore. Cole climbed up beside her and took the reins. You just took it back. As they drove out of town, Rosie felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The confrontation had been terrifying, but also liberating. For the first time, she'd stood up for herself instead of making herself small and hoping to avoid notice. And the world hadn't ended. In fact, she felt more alive than ever. Thank you for letting me handle that myself, she said as the town faded behind them. You didn't need my help. You were magnificent. Cole glanced at her, his storm gray eyes warm. Though, if she'd said one more word about your reputation, I might have intervened regardless. Why does it matter to you so much? What people think of me? The question hung in the air between them as the wagon rolled along the dusty road. Cole was silent for so long that Rosie thought he might not answer. Then he pulled the wagon to a stop on a quiet stretch of road surrounded by nothing but grass and sky. Because you matter to me, he said quietly, not looking at her. More than you probably should, given that you've only been working for me for a month. But there it is. You matter, Rosie. What people say about you, how they treat you, it affects me because He trailed off, seeming to struggle with words. Rosie's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Because you what? Cole turned to face her fully, and the raw vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. Because I care about you. Not just as an employer or even as a friend. I care about you in a way I swore I'd never let myself care about anyone again after losing Rebecca and Sarah. Cole, let me finish. He held up a hand. I know this is complicated. I know people will talk, and I know you might not feel the same way. But I need you to know that when those girls were attacking you, when anyone in this town looks at you with judgment or cruelty, it makes me want to tear the world apart. Because you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. And if I can't make the whole world treat you that way, then at least I can make sure my little corner of it does. Rosie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but these weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. These were tears of something she'd almost forgotten existed, joy, pure and uncomplicated. I care about you too, she whispered. I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was just gratitude or relief at finding work. But it's not. It's more than that. Cole reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face gently in his calloused palm. I'm not an easy man, Rosie. I've got demons and grief and anger that still surprises me sometimes. I can't promise you an easy life. I don't want an easy life. I want an honest one. She leaned into his touch, feeling bolder than she'd ever felt in her life. I want to wake up each morning and know I'm building something real, working beside someone who sees me as I am and doesn't find me lacking. I could never find you lacking. Cole's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear that had escaped. You're the strongest person I've ever known. The bravest, the most determined. Then kiss me, Rosie said, surprising herself with her boldness. Please. Cole's eyes darkened with something that might have been desire, or might have been fear, or might have been both. For a heartbeat, she thought he might refuse. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if afraid she might shatter. But when Rosie responded, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cole rested his forehead against hers. We should probably talk about what this means, he said hoarsely. What do you want it to mean? I want... He pulled back slightly to look at her properly. I want you to be mine. Not as an employee or a tenant or even just a friend. I want to court you properly, with everyone in town knowing my intentions are honorable. I want to give you the respect you deserve. People will talk even more than they already are, Rosie pointed out, though she couldn't keep the smile from her face. Let them talk. I don't give a damn what they think. Cole's expression was fierce now, protective. But I need to know this is what you want. Really want. Not just because I'm offering you security or because you feel obligated. I want this, Rosie said firmly. I want you, not your ranch or your protection or your security, just you, Cole Maddox, with all your demons and grief and anger. I want all of it. The smile that broke across Cole's face was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, rare and beautiful and transformative. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. Then we'll do this right, he said. No hiding, no shame. We'll tell anyone who asks that I'm courting you with the intention of marriage. Marriage? Rosie's breath caught. Eventually, if you'll have me. I'm not proposing right now. We've got time to figure this out properly. But I want you to know my intentions from the start. I'm not interested in anything temporary or halfway. When I commit to something, I commit completely. That sounds like a promise and a warning all at once. It's both. Cole picked up the reins again, but kept one arm around Rosie's shoulders as he got the horses moving. I'm a lot to handle, and I know that. But I swear I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you. You already are, Rosie said softly, leaning into his warmth as they continued toward home. The ranch appeared on the horizon, familiar and welcoming, and Rosie realized with a start that she'd unconsciously started thinking of it as home. Not just the cabin where she slept, but the whole property, the barn she'd cleaned, the fences they'd mended together, the chicken coop where she gathered eggs each morning, the kitchen where they shared meals and conversation. This was home. And Cole was... She didn't have a word for what Cole was yet. More than employer, more than friend, not quite husband, but heading in that direction with a certainty that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. They unloaded the wagon together in companionable silence, working in the easy rhythm they'd developed over the past month. But everything felt different now, charged with new meaning, new possibility. Every accidental brush of hands felt deliberate. Every shared glance held promise. As evening fell and they shared dinner on the porch, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, but somehow it tasted better than ever. Rosie found herself studying Cole's face in the lamplight, the strong jaw, the weathered skin, the eyes that could be so hard one moment and so tender the next. This man who'd terrified her that first day, who the whole town feared and avoided, who'd turned out to be the kindest person she'd ever known. What are you thinking about? Cole asked, catching her staring. About how wrong everyone is about you. About how I almost let their stories keep me from seeing who you really are. To be fair, some of those stories are true. I do have a hell of a temper. But you don't use it to hurt people who don't deserve it. That's the difference. Rosie set down her fork. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever feel guilty for caring about me, for moving on from Rebecca? Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening horizon. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Every day. But I'm learning that guilt and love aren't mutually exclusive. I can miss Rebecca and Sarah with everything in me and still make room for you. It doesn't diminish what I had with them. It just means my heart's bigger than I thought it was. That's beautiful, Rosie whispered. It's the truth. He reached across the table and took her hand. You're not replacing anyone, Rosie. You're writing a new chapter, and maybe that's what we both need, not to forget what came before, but to have the courage to start something new despite our scars. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, hands linked across the table, two wounded souls finding healing in each other's company. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out its lonely song, and the horses in the corral shifted and snorted in their evening routines. I should get to bed, Rosie said reluctantly as the night grew deeper. Early start tomorrow. Always an early start on a ranch. Cole stood and walked her to the edge of the porch, then surprised her by pulling her into a gentle embrace. Sleep well, Rosie Carter. Dream good dreams. Only if they're about you, she teased, then immediately felt her face heat at her own boldness. Cole laughed, a real genuine laugh that made her heart soar. Then definitely dream about me. I'll be doing the same about you. She walked back to her cabin wrapped in warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Behind her, she could feel Cole watching until she was safely inside with her lamp lit, just as he did every night. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like being loved. The next few weeks passed in a golden haze of work and affection. They fell into new rhythms, stolen kisses behind the barn when they thought no one was watching, hands held under the table during meals, conversations that stretched late into the evening as they shared their hopes and fears and dreams for the future. Cole courted her with a seriousness that was both touching and overwhelming. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow beyond the north pasture. He fixed the window in her cabin without being asked, and built her a small bookshelf when he noticed her few precious books stacked on the floor. He taught her to ride his gentlest mare, patient and encouraging as she learned to trust the animal beneath her. And slowly, carefully, he told her more about Rebecca and Sarah. Not to hurt her, or make her feel inadequate, but to help her understand who he'd been and who he was trying to become. Rosie listened to these stories with compassion, seeing them not as competition, but as context, pieces of Cole's past that had shaped him into the man she was falling deeper in love with each day. But happiness, Rosie was learning, was a fragile thing. And in a town like Bitter Springs, where gossip was currency and cruelty was sport, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to shatter it. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. Rosie had ridden into town alone. Cole was dealing with a horse that had thrown a shoe, and she'd insisted she could handle the simple errand of picking up a package at the post office. It should have been quick and easy. She should have known better. She was just leaving the post office, package tucked under her arm, when she saw them, not the boarding house girls this time, but a group of men gathered outside the saloon. They were already drunk despite it being early afternoon, their faces flushed and their eyes mean. "Well, look what we have here," one of them called out, a hulking man named Dutch Kramer who'd been run out of 2 other towns for starting fights. Cole Maddox's little whore, come to town all by herself. Rosie's first instinct was to ignore them and keep walking, but Dutch stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. The other men, 4 of them, spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off her escape routes. "Excuse me," she said firmly, trying to step around him. "Excuse me," Dutch mimicked in a high falsetto, and the other men laughed. "She's got manners, boys. Wonder if she uses them in bed, or if she's more enthusiastic." "Let me pass." Rosie's voice shook despite her efforts to control it. "Why should we? This is a public street. We got as much right to be here as you do." Dutch moved closer, and Rosie could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Though some might say a woman like you, living in sin with a man, no wedding ring, no respectability, don't have much right to anything." "I'm not living in sin. I work for Mr. Maddox. That what you call it?" Another man, this one rail-thin with a cruel smile, spoke up. "Working? Because from what we hear, you're doing a whole different kind of work on your back." The men erupted in harsh laughter, and Rosie felt her face burning with humiliation and fury. She tried again to push past them, but Dutch grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "Not so fast, we were just starting to have fun." His eyes traveled over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Besides, if you're giving it away to Maddox, maybe you'd like to share with the rest of us. Seems only fair." "Let go of me." Rosie tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Or what? You'll tell your keeper? Maybe he don't care what happens to used goods." The rest of Dutch's words were cut off abruptly as he was suddenly yanked backward and thrown to the ground with enough force to raise a cloud of dust. Cole stood over him, his face transformed by rage into something genuinely terrifying, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "Get up," Cole said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get up so I can knock you down again." Dutch scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and bravado. The other men had taken several steps back, suddenly far less eager to continue their harassment now that Cole Maddox stood before them, radiating barely controlled violence. "We were just talking," Dutch said, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the tremor in his voice. "Having a conversation with the lady." "That wasn't a conversation. That was assault." Cole's voice was still terrifyingly calm, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been shouting. "You put your hands on her. You threatened her. And you used words I'm not going to repeat because they don't deserve to be spoken out loud. Now hold on, Maddox. No, you hold on." Cole took a step forward, and Dutch automatically retreated. "You're going to apologize to Miss Carter right now. A genuine, sincere apology. And then you're going to walk away and never speak to her again. If I so much as hear that you looked at her wrong, I will find you, and I will make you regret every decision that led you to this moment. Am I making myself clear?" Dutch's eyes darted to his friends, looking for support, but they had all suddenly become very interested in examining their boots. He swallowed hard and turned to Rosie. I apologize, Miss Carter. I was out of line." "Louder," Cole demanded, "and mean it." "I apologize," Dutch's voice cracked slightly. "I was drunk and stupid, and I said things I shouldn't have. It won't happen again." Cole didn't move, didn't take his eyes off Dutch's face. "Get out of my sight, all of you, and spread the word. Miss Carter is under my protection. Anyone who disrespects her answers to me. No exceptions." The men scattered like startled rabbits, Dutch leading the retreat with considerably less swagger than he'd displayed minutes earlier. Cole watched them go, his jaw clenched so tight Rosie could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. Then he turned to her, and the rage in his expression transformed instantly to concern. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" Cole's hands hovered over her arm where Dutch had grabbed her, not quite touching but clearly wanting to assess the damage. "I'm all right, just shaken." Rosie was trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline making her hands shake. "How did you know I needed help?" "I finished with the horse sooner than expected and came looking for you, saw the crowd gathering and heard—" He stopped, his jaw clenching again. "I heard what they were saying. If I'd been 30 seconds later, if he'd done anything more than grab your arm, I would have killed him. I mean that literally, Rosie. I would have killed him and not regretted it." The raw honesty in his voice should have frightened her, but instead Rosie felt only gratitude and something deeper. The knowledge that this man would go to war for her without hesitation, that his love came with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd already lost too much. "Take me home," she said quietly. "Please. I just want to go home." Cole helped her onto his horse. The wagon was still back at the ranch, and climbed up behind her, one arm wrapped securely around her waist as they rode. Rosie leaned back against his chest, drawing comfort from his solid presence, trying not to think about what could have happened if he hadn't arrived when he did. By the time they reached the ranch, word of the confrontation had somehow already spread. They found Sheriff Tom Blackwell waiting in the yard, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Heard there was trouble in town," the sheriff said without preamble. "Dutch Kramer and his friends making accusations, you threatening violence. Want to tell me your side of it, Maddox?" Cole dismounted and helped Rosie down before turning to face the sheriff. "My side is simple. 5 drunk men surrounded Miss Carter on a public street and harassed her. One of them put hands on her against her will and made explicit threats of sexual violence. I intervened and demanded an apology, which I received. Then I sent them on their way. If that counts as threatening violence in this town, then I'm guilty as charged." Sheriff Blackwell's expression softened slightly as he looked at Rosie. "That how it happened, Miss Carter?" "Yes, sir, exactly as Mr. Maddox described." Rosie's voice was steadier now, strengthened by Cole's presence and her own anger at the injustice of the sheriff even questioning them. "Those men accosted me, used vile language, and one grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. Mr. Maddox defended me, that's all." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Finally, he sighed. Dutch and his boys are claiming Maddox attacked them unprovoked, said they were just passing time outside the saloon when he came charging in looking for a fight. They're lying, Cole said flatly. I figured as much. Dutch Kramer's been trouble in every town he's set foot in. The sheriff adjusted his hat. But here's the problem. You've got a reputation in this town, Maddox. People know about your temper. When there's a confrontation and you're involved, folks are inclined to believe you started it, regardless of the truth. So what are you saying? Cole's voice had taken on that dangerous edge again. That Rosie should have just accepted their harassment because standing up for her makes me look violent? I'm saying you need to be careful, both of you. The sheriff's gaze moved between them. You're living in a small town where appearances matter more than they should. A single man and a young woman living on the same property, not married. It's already fuel for gossip. Add in public confrontations and accusations, and you're giving people ammunition to use against you. Let them talk, Cole said dismissively. It's not just talk anymore. There are people in town, influential people, who are starting to say Miss Carter's situation out here is improper, that maybe someone should intervene for her own good. Rosie felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Intervene how? Mrs. Hutchins from the boarding house has been making noise about moral standards and community responsibility. She's got the church ladies on her side, and between them they've got the ear of half the town council. The sheriff looked uncomfortable delivering this news. I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm just saying you should be aware that this situation is drawing attention, and not the good kind. What exactly are they planning? Cole's voice had gone quiet again, which Rosie had learned meant he was at his most dangerous. Nothing concrete yet, but there's talk of declaring Miss Carter's living situation inappropriate and potentially forcing her back to town for her own protection. Some are even suggesting that if she won't go willingly, the town has a responsibility to intervene legally. On what grounds? Rosie demanded, finding her voice. I'm 18 years old, of legal age to make my own decisions. I'm employed legitimately and living in separate quarters from my employer. They can't force me to do anything. Legally, you're right, but in a town this size, legal and actual can be two different things. The sheriff shifted his weight uncomfortably. I'm trying to warn you that you've got enemies, and they're looking for any excuse to cause trouble. The fight today, even though you were completely in the right, it's just going to make things worse. Cole was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened his shoulders and looked the sheriff directly in the eye. Then we'll remove their excuse, he said firmly. Rosie and I have been courting with the intention of marriage. I'm making that intention formal as of right now. You can tell Mrs. Hutchins and her church ladies and anyone else who cares to listen that I'll be speaking to the pastor about setting a wedding date within the month. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. You're serious? Dead serious. Cole turned to Rosie, and something in his expression made her breath catch. That is, if Miss Carter will have me. I know this isn't the proposal you deserve. No romance, no proper courtship period, just practicality and strategy. But my feelings are genuine, Rosie. I want to marry you because I love you, not just to satisfy the town gossips. If you need more time, if this is too fast, I'll understand. We'll find another way. Rosie looked at this man who'd defended her without hesitation, who'd given her work and shelter and kindness when everyone else had offered only cruelty. She thought about the past 2 months, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, the way he made her feel safe and valued and seen. She thought about the kiss they'd shared on the road from town, about the future they'd tentatively begun to imagine together. Yes, she said simply. I'll marry you. Cole's expression transformed, relief and joy replacing the tension that had held him rigid. He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together, and for a moment it was as if the sheriff wasn't even there. You're sure? He asked quietly, needing to hear it again. I'm sure. I love you, Cole Maddox. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first day when you gave me a chance instead of throwing me out like everyone expected. The sheriff cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. Well then, congratulations, I suppose. I'll spread the word that you're engaged to be married. That should quiet some of the talk. Appreciate it, Sheriff? Cole shook the man's hand without releasing Rosie's. And I appreciate you coming out here to warn us, instead of just letting them blindside us with whatever they were planning. After the sheriff left, Cole turned to Rosie with an expression that was equal parts exhilaration and concern. I'm sorry, that wasn't how I wanted to propose. I had it all planned out. Was going to wait until we'd been courting for a proper amount of time. Was going to take you somewhere special. Was going to do it right. It was perfect, Rosie said, and meant it. Because it was real. Because you were trying to protect me while still giving me a choice. That means more than any elaborate romantic gesture could. Still, you deserve better than a proposal motivated by town gossip and threats. What I deserve is what I have. A man who loves me enough to fight for me, literally and figuratively. A man who sees me as an equal partner, not a possession to be managed. A man who asks instead of demands. She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard under her palm. That's you, Cole. You're what I deserve and what I want. He pulled her into an embrace then, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice, he murmured against her temple. I swear it. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd found each other in the ruins of their separate tragedies, choosing to build something new together. Around them, the ranch continued its evening routines. Horses nickering for their dinner, chickens settling onto their roosts, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Finally, Cole released her and stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand. We should go into town tomorrow and speak with Pastor Mitchell. Set a date, make it official. The sooner we're married, the sooner those vultures will have to find someone else to prey on. Tomorrow, Rosie agreed. But tonight, let's just be us. No town gossip, no threats, no drama. Just us and the ranch and the quiet. They made dinner together in Cole's kitchen. A simple stew with vegetables from the garden Rosie had helped him plant, bread that she'd learned to bake in his wood-fired oven. They ate on the porch, as they always did, talking quietly about small things, important things, meaningless things. And when the meal was finished and the dishes washed, Cole walked her back to her cabin as he did every night. But this time, when they reached her door, he pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. My future wife, he murmured against her lips. I like the sound of that. My future husband, she replied, testing out the words. They felt right, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The next morning, they rode into town together, and this time there was no pretense of employee and employer. Cole helped her down from the wagon with obvious affection, kept his hand on the small of her back as they walked, made it abundantly clear to anyone watching that this was a man with his intended bride. Pastor Mitchell was a kindly man in his 60s who'd known Cole since he first arrived in Bitter Springs. He welcomed them into his small office, attached to the church with genuine warmth. Though Rosie caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes when Cole announced their intention to marry. This is wonderful news, the pastor said, settling into his chair behind a cluttered desk. Though I confess I'm a bit surprised by the timing. You've only been acquainted for a short while, haven't you? 2 months, Cole confirmed. But when you know, you know. I lost one wife already, Pastor. I learned the hard way that life is too short to waste time pretending you don't care about someone when you do. Pastor Mitchell's expression softened with understanding. A fair point. And you, Miss Carter, you're certain this is what you want? No one is pressuring you? I'm certain, Rosie said firmly. Mr. Maddox, Cole, has been nothing but honorable in his intentions. I know my own mind, and I choose this. I choose him. Well then, the pastor pulled a large ledger from his desk drawer and opened it to a page marked with ribbon. Let's discuss dates. The earliest I could perform the ceremony would be 3 weeks from Saturday. That would give time for the banns to be read and for you both to make proper preparations. 3 weeks is perfect, Cole said, glancing at Rosie for confirmation. She nodded her agreement. They spent the next hour going over details. The ceremony would be simple, held in the church on a Saturday afternoon, with a small reception following for any townspeople who wished to attend. Rosie would need a dress, which Cole immediately offered to pay for, though she protested. You're already paying for the ceremony and the reception, she argued as they left the pastor's office. I can manage a dress on my own. You've been saving every penny of your wages. I'm not having you spend it all on a dress you'll wear once. Cole's tone brooked no argument. Besides, I want to do this. Let me give you this one thing. You've already given me everything, Rosie said softly, but she could see she wasn't going to win this particular battle. They were heading back to the wagon when a familiar voice called out from across the street. Mrs. Hutchins stood in front of her boarding house, her expression a complicated mixture of vindication and disapproval. Mr. Maddox, Miss Carter, I heard the news of your engagement. She crossed the street to stand before them, her posture rigid with propriety. I hope you both understand that this validates many of the concerns that have been expressed about your living situation. With respect, Mrs. Hutchins, our engagement validates nothing except that we care for each other and want to build a life together. Cole's voice was controlled but firm. Whatever concerns you and your friends have manufactured about Miss Carter's character are your problem, not ours. Manufactured? Mrs. Hutchins' face reddened. The girl was living alone with you, unchaperoned, miles from town. It's hardly manufacturing concern to point out the impropriety. She was living in a separate building, working an honest job, and earning an honest wage. The only impropriety here is the way you and your boarding house girls treated her when she lived under your roof. Cole took a step forward, and Mrs. Hutchins automatically retreated. You knew she was being bullied, and you did nothing. You knew those girls sent her to my ranch as a cruel joke, and you allowed it. So don't you dare stand here and lecture us about propriety when you couldn't even manage basic human kindness. I never You did, and we both know it. Cole's voice was cold as winter ice. Now, if you'll excuse us, my fiancé and I have wedding preparations to attend to. I'm sure you'll receive your invitation in due course, though I wouldn't blame you if you chose not to attend. He guided Rosie toward the wagon, leaving Mrs. Hutchins sputtering behind them. Once they were out of earshot, Rosie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You didn't have to defend me so harshly, she said, though she was secretly pleased that he had. Yes, I did. She needed to hear it, and you deserved to hear someone finally call out her hypocrisy. Cole helped her up onto the wagon seat. Besides, we're going to be married in 3 weeks. That means your enemies are my enemies, and your battles are my battles. She'd better get used to it. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the massive change that was about to occur in their lives. 3 weeks seemed simultaneously like forever, and no time at all. 3 weeks to transform from employer and employee to husband and wife. 3 weeks to silence the gossips and legitimize their relationship in the eyes of the town. 3 weeks until Rosie Carter became Rosie Maddox. The thought sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with escaping scandal and everything to do with the man sitting beside her, the man she'd come to love with a depth that still sometimes surprised her. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Cole insisted on hiring a seamstress from the next town over to make Rosie a proper wedding dress, not wanting to give the Bitter Springs gossips the satisfaction of being involved in their preparations. The seamstress, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Chen, came out to the ranch to take measurements and discuss designs. Something simple but elegant, Rosie said, running her fingers over the fabric samples Mrs. Chen had brought. I don't need anything elaborate. Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day, Mrs. Chen replied firmly. She held up a bolt of ivory silk that caught the light beautifully. This would be perfect with your coloring. We'll make it with a fitted bodice and a full skirt, maybe some delicate embroidery on the sleeves. Nothing too fussy, but refined. Elegant. Rosie caught Cole watching from the doorway, his expression soft in a way that made her heart flutter. What do you think? She asked him. I think you'll be beautiful in whatever you wear, he said honestly. But that fabric is nice. Matches your eyes somehow. Mrs. Chen beamed at him. A man who notices such things. Miss Carter, you've found yourself a good one. I know, Rosie said, meeting Cole's eyes across the room. Believe me, I know. In between wedding preparations, life on the ranch continued. The work didn't stop just because they were planning a wedding. If anything, Cole seemed determined to get the property in perfect condition before the ceremony, as if he wanted everything to reflect the new beginning they were embarking on together. They repainted the main house, fixed the sagging gate at the north pasture, repaired a section of roof on the barn that had been leaking during rainstorms. Rosie worked beside Cole through it all, her body now strong enough to handle even the heaviest tasks without complaint. She'd changed so much from the frightened girl who'd walked up his road 2 months ago, changed in ways that went far deeper than just physical strength. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Cole voiced the thought that had been on both their minds. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly. "About getting married?" Rosie considered the question carefully before answering. "Not scared, exactly. Maybe aware of how big this is, how permanent. But not in a bad way. More like standing at the edge of something important and knowing that once you step forward, there's no going back." "There's still time to change your mind," Cole said, though the tightness in his voice betrayed how much the thought pained him. "If you're having doubts—" "I'm not having doubts about you," Rosie interrupted, reaching for his hand. "About us. I'm just aware that in 2 weeks, everything changes. We won't just be Cole and Rosie anymore. We'll be husband and wife. That's a big responsibility." "The biggest," Cole agreed. "But I'm ready for it. More than ready. I've been alone for so long, Rosie. I forgot what it felt like to have someone to share things with, to build a life with. You've reminded me what it means to actually live instead of just existing." "You've done the same for me," Rosie said softly. "I was so small before I met you, so afraid of taking up space or being noticed. But you've made me feel like I matter, like I'm allowed to be big and loud and unapologetic about existing. You've always mattered. You just needed someone to see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, hands linked, watching as the stars began to peer in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, and an owl called out its haunting question to the night. "Cole?" Rosie said eventually. "Can I ask you something that might be difficult?" "Always." "Do you think Rebecca would approve? Of us, I mean. Of you moving on and getting remarried?" Cole was quiet for so long that Rosie began to regret asking. Then he squeezed her hand gently and spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I think Rebecca would want me to be happy. She was like that, generous with her love, never possessive or jealous. She knew life was too short to waste on regrets or what-ifs." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Before she died, in those last few hours when we both knew she wasn't going to make it, she made me promise something. Made me swear on Sarah's life that I wouldn't shut myself away, wouldn't let grief turn me bitter and hard. She said life was for the living, and I owed it to her memory to actually live. I broke that promise for a long time," he continued. "Spent years being exactly what she'd made me swear not to become. Bitter, angry, isolated. But meeting you, it's like I finally remembered how to keep my promise to her. So yes, I think Rebecca would approve. I think she'd be glad I found someone who makes me want to be better, who reminds me that I'm still capable of love and joy and building something good." Rosie felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. "Thank you for telling me that, for sharing her with me instead of keeping her locked away like a secret. She was too important to be a secret, and you're too important to live in anyone's shadow." Cole pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You're not replacing anyone, Rosie. You're writing a new story, our story, and it's going to be a good one." The days continued to count down toward the wedding with a momentum that felt both too fast and not fast enough. Mrs. Chen delivered the wedding dress with a week to spare, and when Rosie tried it on in her cabin, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her from the small mirror Cole had hung on the wall. The ivory silk draped beautifully over her now strong frame, the fitted bodice emphasizing curves that hard work and regular meals had enhanced rather than diminished. The sleeves were delicately embroidered with tiny flowers, and the full skirt moved like water when she turned. She looked elegant. She looked beautiful. She looked like a bride. Cole had agreed not to see the dress until the wedding day, honoring the tradition even though he claimed it was superstitious nonsense. But when Rosie emerged from her cabin wearing her everyday work clothes again, he took one look at her face and smiled. "It fits well?" he asked. "It's perfect." "Good." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Then I have something for you. Consider it an early wedding present." Inside the box was a delicate gold ring set with a small but beautiful sapphire. Rosie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Cole, this is too much." "It was Rebecca's," he said quietly. "Her engagement ring. I couldn't bring myself to sell it or get rid of it, but I couldn't figure out what to do with it either. Then I realized she'd want it to keep being part of a love story. She'd want it to mean something again. He took the ring from the box and held it up to the light. If it's too painful, if you'd rather have something different, I'll understand, but I wanted to offer it. Wanted you to have something that connects all of us, past and present, the love that was and the love that is. Rosie held out her left hand, fingers trembling slightly. I'd be honored to wear it. Cole slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. The sapphire caught the afternoon sunlight, throwing tiny blue sparkles across her skin. It was beautiful, yes, but more than that. It was a symbol of trust, of Cole's willingness to let go of the past while still honoring it, of the unique love story they were creating together. 1 week, Cole said, his hand still holding hers. 7 more days, and you'll be my wife. 7 more days, Rosie echoed, her heart full to bursting with joy and anticipation, and love so deep it felt like it could swallow her whole in the best possible way. The final week passed in a strange mixture of normal routine and building excitement. They continued to work the ranch together, but now every task felt tinged with significance. This was the last time they'd mend this fence as employer and employee. The last time they'd share this meal as anything other than an engaged couple about to be married. The townspeople, for the most part, seemed to have accepted the engagement as a fait accompli. A few of the more judgmental church ladies still whispered when Rosie passed, but the open hostility had diminished now that she had the protection of impending respectability. Even Vera and her friends had gone quiet, perhaps realizing that they'd lost whatever game they'd been playing when Rosie had found genuine happiness despite their best efforts to prevent it. The night before the wedding, Cole insisted that Rosie stay at the ranch rather than attempting to find lodging in town, as tradition might suggest. I'm not superstitious about you seeing the dress. And I'm not superstitious about bad luck, he said firmly. What I am is protective of you, and I'm not having you spend the night before our wedding anywhere but home where you're safe. So Rosie stayed in her cabin, though sleep proved elusive. She lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night, thinking about how tomorrow everything would change, and yet somehow stay the same. She'd still wake up here, still work beside Cole, still share meals and conversation and quiet evenings on the porch. But she'd do it all as his wife, as Rosie Maddox, as someone who finally belonged somewhere. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rosie rose and began preparing for the most important day of her life. She washed carefully in the basin, using the lavender-scented soap Cole had brought her from town the previous week. She brushed her hair until it shone, then pinned it up in a style that was both elegant and simple, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. The wedding dress slipped over her head like a dream made tangible. Mrs. Chen had done extraordinary work. Every seam was perfect, every stitch invisible, the embroidery on the sleeves catching the morning light with delicate beauty. Rosie stood before her small mirror, turning slowly to see herself from every angle, and felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. 3 months ago, she'd been nothing, nobody. A girl sent to this ranch as a cruel joke, expected to fail, expected to be humiliated and sent away. Now she was a bride, about to marry a man who saw her worth, who valued her strength, who loved her not despite her scars, but because she'd survived long enough to acquire them. A knock at her cabin door made her turn. "Rosie? You decent? I brought you something." She opened the door to find Mrs. Chen standing there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with ivory ribbon. The seamstress's face broke into a wide smile when she saw Rosie in the completed dress. "Oh, my dear, you're absolutely radiant," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes shining. "Mr. Maddox is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." She handed over the bouquet. "I gathered these this morning from the meadow. Nothing fancy, but I thought they suited you better than hothouse roses, wild and beautiful and stronger than they look." "They're perfect," Rosie said, accepting the flowers with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Chen. The dress, the flowers, your kindness. It means more than you know." "Nonsense! Every bride deserves to feel special on her wedding day." Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Now, we should get you to town. The ceremony starts at 2 o'clock, and it's already past noon." The ride into Bitter Springs felt surreal, as if Rosie was watching herself from outside her own body. Mrs. Chen drove the small cart she'd arrived in, chattering pleasantly about the weather and the beauty of the autumn season, clearly trying to keep Rosie's nerves at bay. It worked mostly, though Rosie's hands trembled slightly as they held the bouquet. When they arrived at the church, Rosie was surprised to see that the small building was nearly full. She'd expected a sparse crowd, just the requisite witnesses and perhaps a few curious townspeople. Instead, nearly every pew held someone, and more people stood along the walls. As she entered through the side door that led to the small preparation room, she caught glimpses of faces she recognized from the general store, the feed shop, even a few ranch hands from neighboring properties. Pastor Mitchell was waiting in the preparation room, his kind face creased with a warm smile. "Miss Carter, you look absolutely lovely. Are you ready?" "I am," Rosie said, and was pleased to find her voice steady and strong. "More than ready." "Excellent. Mr. Maddox is already at the altar, looking about as nervous as I've ever seen him, which is saying something." The pastor's eyes twinkled. "I'll give the signal when we're ready to begin. Until then, take a moment, breathe. Remember that this day is about you and Cole, not about all those people out there." He left her alone, and Rosie took his advice, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. She thought about this journey that had brought her here, the cruelty and the kindness, the fear and the courage. The moment she'd decided to walk up to Cole's ranch, despite knowing it was a joke. She thought about how close she'd come to a very different life, one of continued humiliation and powerlessness. But she'd chosen differently. She'd chosen to keep going, to work hard, to stand up for herself. And in doing so, she'd found not just employment or shelter, but love. Real, deep, complicated love with a man who was just as scarred and broken as she was, and just as determined to heal. The music started. A simple melody played on the church's old organ by someone whose name Rosie didn't know. That was her signal. She smoothed her skirt one final time, adjusted her grip on the bouquet, and stepped toward the door that would lead her into the sanctuary. Pastor Mitchell opened it for her with an encouraging nod, and Rosie stepped through. The church fell silent as every head turned to look at her. For a heartbeat, old fears threatened to resurface. All those people staring, judging, finding her wanting. But then her eyes found Cole at the front of the church, and everything else fell away. He stood beside the altar in a dark suit she'd never seen him wear, his hair neatly combed, his beard freshly trimmed. But it was his expression that stole her breath, pure, undisguised wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His storm-gray eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when their gazes met, he smiled with such open joy that Rosie felt answering tears spring to her own eyes. She began walking down the aisle, keeping her pace measured and steady despite wanting to run. As she passed the pews, she registered faces here and there. Sheriff Blackwell, looking pleased. Mr. Henderson from the general store, actually smiling for once. Henry Walsh, who must have ridden back specifically for the wedding, giving her an enthusiastic thumbs up. And there, in one of the middle pews, looking distinctly uncomfortable, sat Vera, Margaret, and Sarah. They'd come after all, though whether out of genuine interest or morbid curiosity, Rosie couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. Their presence here, watching her marry Cole Maddox, was vindication enough. But she didn't linger on them. Her attention was focused entirely on Cole, who watched her approach with an intensity that made her heart race. When she finally reached the altar and he offered his hand to help her up the single step, his fingers trembled slightly against hers. "You're beautiful," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. "So damn beautiful I can't find words for it." "You clean up pretty well yourself," she whispered back, making him smile. Pastor Mitchell cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention back to the ceremony at hand. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Cole James Maddox and Rosie Ann Carter in holy matrimony." The words of the ceremony washed over Rosie in waves, traditional phrases about love and commitment, about choosing to bind yourself to another person for all the days of your life. She'd heard these words before at other weddings, but they'd never meant anything to her then. Now they meant everything. When Pastor Mitchell asked if anyone objected to the union, There was a moment of tense silence. Rosie felt Cole's hand tighten on hers, as if preparing to fight off any challenger. But the moment passed without incident, and the pastor continued. Cole James Maddox, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? I do. Cole's voice was rough with emotion, but absolutely certain. God help me, I do. And do you, Rosie Ann Carter, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part. Rosie looked into Cole's eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. The good days and the hard ones, the laughter and the tears, the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. She saw partnership and respect and a love that had been forged in the fires of shared pain and mutual healing. I do, she said clearly, wanting everyone in that church to hear her certainty. I absolutely do. Cole produced 2 simple gold bands from his pocket. He'd ridden to the next county to have them made, wanting something special that wasn't tainted by Bitter Springs gossip. He slipped one onto Rosie's finger, his hand steady now, speaking the traditional words with a sincerity that made them new. With this ring I thee wed. My body I give to thee, my heart I pledge to thee, my worldly goods I share with thee. From this day forward, you are my wife, my partner, my home. Rosie took the second ring with trembling fingers and slid it onto Cole's hand, her voice breaking slightly as she repeated the vows. With this ring I thee wed. My body I give to thee, my heart I pledge to thee, my worldly goods I share with thee. From this day forward, you are my husband, my partner, my home. Pastor Mitchell beamed at them both. By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cole, you may kiss your bride. Cole didn't need to be told twice. He cupped Rosie's face in both his hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. It was different from their previous kisses. Those had been tentative, exploratory, still testing the waters of what they could be to each other. This kiss was a promise, a claiming, a declaration that they belonged to each other now in the eyes of God and man. When they finally broke apart, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Cole kept one arm firmly around Rosie's waist as they turned to face their witnesses, both of them grinning like fools. Pastor Mitchell gestured toward the registry book, and they moved to sign their names. Cole's bold and decisive, Rosie's slightly shaky but clear. Rosie Maddox. Her new name, her new identity, her new life. As they walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife now, Rosie caught Vera's expression. The other woman's face was a complicated mixture of emotions: surprise, envy, something that might have been grudging respect. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Rosie saw the exact instant when Vera realized that the joke had well and truly backfired. The girl they'd sent away as a prank had not only survived but thrived, finding love and happiness in the place they'd meant to be her downfall. Rosie didn't gloat or smirk, she simply held Vera's gaze for a heartbeat, then looked away, dismissing her former tormentor as irrelevant. That chapter of her life was closed. Whatever power those girls had once held over her was gone, burned away in the forge of hard work and genuine love. Outside the church, they were immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Henry Walsh clapped Cole on the back so hard he nearly stumbled, laughing with genuine delight. "Damn good choice, my friend. Damn good choice." Sheriff Blackwell shook both their hands, his weathered face creased with approval. "Congratulations. You're good for each other. Anyone with eyes can see that." Even Mr. Henderson approached, awkward but sincere. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, testing out her new name, "welcome to the family of respectable married women. I hope you'll continue to patronize my store." "Of course, Mr. Henderson," Rosie replied with a smile, "though I expect better treatment than I received as Miss Carter." The storekeeper had the grace to look embarrassed. "You'll get it. You have my word." The reception was held in the church's meeting hall, a simple affair with cake that Mrs. Chen had made, punch that tasted suspiciously spiked despite the pastor's presence, and sandwiches prepared by various townswomen who'd apparently decided that attending a scandalous wedding was preferable to missing out on gossip. Cole and Rosie stood together near the cake table, accepting congratulations and dodging intrusive questions with practiced ease. They'd agreed beforehand that they wouldn't let anyone ruin this day with prying or judgment, and so far they were succeeding. Mrs. Hutchins approached eventually, her expression carefully neutral. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Maddox. I hope you'll be very happy together." "Thank you, Mrs. Hutchins," Cole said evenly. "We will be." The boarding house matron hesitated, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "Miss Carter, Mrs. Maddox, I owe you an apology. I allowed those girls to treat you poorly when you lived under my roof, and I turned a blind eye when I should have intervened. That was wrong of me. I hope you can forgive me, though I don't deserve it." Rosie was so surprised she nearly dropped her punch cup. Of all the things she'd expected today, a genuine apology from Mrs. Hutchins wasn't one of them. She studied the older woman's face, looking for signs of insincerity, but found only honest regret. "Thank you for saying that," Rosie said finally. "It means more than you might think. And yes, I forgive you. Holding on to anger would only poison my happiness, and I have too much of that now to risk it." Mrs. Hutchins' expression softened with relief. "You're a better woman than I am, my dear. Your husband is a lucky man." "I'm a lucky woman," Rosie corrected gently. "We're lucky together." After Mrs. Hutchins moved away, Cole leaned down to murmur in Rosie's ear. "That was gracious of you, more gracious than she deserved." "Maybe, but grace isn't about what people deserve. It's about who we choose to be." Rosie squeezed his hand. "Besides, I'm too happy to carry grudges. Let them all think what they want. We know the truth." As the afternoon wore on and the reception began to wind down, various guests started making their departures. Vera and her friends left early, still looking uncomfortable and out of place. The townspeople who'd come more out of curiosity than genuine goodwill gradually filtered out as well. But the people who mattered, Henry Walsh, Sheriff Blackwell, Mrs. Chen, even a few of the neighboring ranchers who'd gotten to know Cole over the years, those people stayed, laughing and talking and celebrating with genuine warmth. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Cole caught Rosie's eye and tilted his head toward the door. She nodded, understanding immediately. It was time to go home. They said their goodbyes, collected the few wedding gifts that had been pressed upon them, and climbed into the wagon for the ride back to the ranch. Cole had decorated it with ribbons that fluttered in the breeze, a touch of romance that had probably embarrassed him to arrange, but that made Rosie's heart swell with affection. As they left town behind, the noise and crowds fading into the distance, a comfortable silence settled over them. Cole kept one arm around Rosie's waist, holding her close against his side, while guiding the horses with his free hand. "Well, Miss Maddox," he said eventually, his voice warm with satisfaction, "how does it feel to be a married woman?" "It feels right," Rosie replied honestly. "Like everything that came before was just preparation for this. For us." "I know what you mean. These past 3 months have been—" He trailed off, searching for words. "Transformative. That's the only way I can describe it. You transformed me, Rosie. Made me remember how to be human again instead of just existing. You did the same for me. Before I met you, I was so small, so afraid. I let people make me feel worthless because I believed them when they said I was." She looked up at him, this man who was now her husband, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude and love. "But you saw something in me that first day, something worth protecting, worth investing in. You gave me work when I needed it, but more than that, you gave me dignity, respect, a chance to prove what I could do." "You proved it 100 times over," Cole said firmly. "The way you tackled that barn, the way you stood up to those girls, the way you've handled every challenge thrown at you. You're remarkable, Rosie, always were. I just made sure you had the space to show it." They lapsed into comfortable silence again as the ranch came into view. Home. The word resonated in Rosie's chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. This was truly home now, not just a place she worked or a cabin she rented, but home in the deepest sense of the word, the place where she belonged, with the person she belonged to. Cole pulled the wagon up in front of the main house and climbed down, then turned to help Rosie. But instead of simply offering his hand, he swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest with surprising ease. "Cole, what are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said with a grin. "It's tradition. We're not even at the threshold yet. Practice run." He carried her up the porch steps and kicked open the door, which he'd apparently left unlocked in preparation for exactly this moment. Inside, he set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Maddox." "I've been living here for 3 months," Rosie pointed out with a laugh. "Yes, but now it's official. Now this is your home, not just your workplace. Everything here is ours together." He gestured around the kitchen, which Rosie noticed was cleaner than usual and had fresh flowers on the table. "I want you to change anything you want. Move furniture, redecorate, make it feel like yours. This is your house now, too." Rosie looked around the familiar space with new eyes. He was right. It did feel different now. Before, she'd always been a guest here, careful not to intrude or overstep. Now she could rearrange the shelves if she wanted, could hang curtains in the windows, could make this space truly reflect both of them. "There's something I want to show you," Cole said, taking her hand and leading her toward the hallway she'd rarely ventured down. It led to the bedrooms, Cole's room, and 2 others that had remained closed during her entire time at the ranch. He stopped in front of the largest of the closed doors and turned to face her, his expression suddenly uncertain. "I've been working on this for the past 2 weeks. Wanted it to be ready for when we got married. If you don't like it, we can change it. But I hope you'll see what I was trying to do." He opened the door to reveal a bedroom that had been completely transformed. The walls were freshly painted in a warm cream color. A large 4-poster bed dominated the space, covered in a beautiful quilt that looked handmade. New curtains hung at the windows, filtering the afternoon light into a soft glow. A wardrobe stood against one wall, and a vanity with a proper mirror had been positioned near the window. But what caught Rosie's attention was the small touches that showed how much thought Cole had put into this. A vase of wildflowers on the vanity, books on the shelf beside the bed, including a few she'd mentioned wanting to read during their evening conversations. A photograph on the nightstand that showed Cole, Rebecca, and baby Sarah, but positioned in a way that honored their memory without dominating the space. "Cole," Rosie breathed, moving into the room with wonder. This is beautiful. When did you have time to do all this?" "I've been working on it late at night after you went to your cabin. Henry helped when he visited. He's better with paint than I am. Mrs. Chen helped with the curtains and the quilt." He came to stand beside her, watching her face anxiously. "I wanted you to have a space that was ours, not just mine. A place where we could build new memories together." Rosie turned to face him, tears streaming freely down her cheeks now. "It's perfect. You're perfect. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm so grateful I walked up that road 3 months ago." "You deserved everything good that's happened to you," Cole said fiercely, pulling her close. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that." He kissed her then, different from the chaste kiss in the church. This kiss held promise and passion and the certainty that they had the rest of their lives to explore this love they'd found. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cole rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Rosie Maddox, more than I thought I was still capable of loving anyone. I love you too, Cole Maddox, with everything I am." As evening settled over the ranch, they stood together in their new bedroom, 2 people who'd found each other in the ruins of their separate tragedies and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Outside, the world continued on. Bitter Springs with its gossips and judgments, the boarding house girls with their cruelties, all the people who doubted and dismissed and tried to make Rosie small. But none of that mattered anymore. She was Rosie Maddox now, wife to a good man, partner in a working ranch, no longer the butt of anyone's jokes or the target of anyone's cruelty. She'd walked through fire and come out stronger, had faced humiliation and found dignity, had been sent away as a joke and returned as a bride. The weeks turned into months, and fall gave way to winter. Rosie and Cole settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked the ranch together through the changing seasons, their partnership deepening with each passing day. The town gradually accepted them as a legitimate couple, though there were always a few who whispered about the speed of their courtship or the circumstances of their meeting. Let them whisper. Rosie had learned that people who'd never struggled, never faced real adversity, could never understand what it meant to recognize salvation when it appeared. She and Cole had found each other at exactly the right moment, when both were ready to risk being hurt again, when both had learned enough from their past to build a better future. One cold December evening, as they sat together on the porch wrapped in blankets and watching snow fall softly over the ranch, Rosie reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked Cole. "If I'd refused to come that first day? If you'd actually thrown me out like they expected?" "All the time," Cole admitted. "I think about how close I came to missing this, missing you. If I'd been in a worse mood that day, if I'd been less willing to see past the joke to the person underneath, if I'd let my anger control me instead of my better judgment." He shook his head. "We almost didn't happen, Rosie. That terrifies me. But we did happen. That's what matters." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "We chose each other, even when we didn't have to, even when it would have been easier to stay alone and bitter." "Best choice I ever made," Cole murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the snow transform their ranch into a winter wonderland. In the distance, a wolf howled, and the horses in the barn shifted and snorted in response. The world continued on, indifferent to their small story of redemption and love. But to Cole and Rosie, their story was everything. It was proof that cruel jokes could be transformed into blessings, that humiliation could be the first step toward dignity, that two broken people could heal each other if they were brave enough to try. The joke that was meant to destroy Rosie had instead delivered her to exactly where she needed to be. The angry rancher the town feared had turned out to be the gentlest man she'd ever known. And the girl everyone dismissed as worthless had proven to be worth everything to the one person whose opinion truly mattered. As spring returned and the ranch came back to life, Rosie discovered she was pregnant. The news sent Cole into a panic of joy and terror. He'd lost one child already, and the thought of risking that pain again nearly paralyzed him. But Rosie was strong and healthy from her months of hard work, and when their son was born on a warm June morning, Cole held the squalling infant with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Samuel," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with wonder. "We'll call him Samuel. It means God has heard." "Samuel Maddox," Rosie agreed, exhausted but radiant. "Do you think Sarah would have liked being a big sister?" "She'd have loved it," Cole said with certainty. "She'd have bossed this little guy around like nobody's business, and he'd have adored her for it." They raised Samuel together on that ranch, teaching him about hard work and honesty and treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. As he grew, they told him the story of how they met, not shying away from the cruelty or the struggle, but also celebrating the triumph of choosing love over bitterness. Other children followed, two daughters who had their mother's determination and their father's fierce protectiveness. The ranch prospered under Cole and Rosie's joint management, becoming known throughout the territory for its quality horses and the unusual partnership of its owners. People came from miles around to buy stock from the Maddox Ranch, and they always left impressed by the quiet competence of the woman who worked beside her husband as an equal partner. Years later, when Samuel was 10 and helping his father mend a fence, he asked the question that children always eventually ask. "Pa, is it true what they say in town, that Ma came here as a joke?" Cole looked over at Rosie, who was working in the garden with their daughters, her face lined now with age and contentment, her body still strong despite the years. She looked up and caught his eye, and they shared a smile that held 15 years of love and partnership. "It's true," Cole told his son honestly. "Some cruel girls sent your mother here hoping to humiliate her. They thought I'd throw her out or treat her badly. They wanted to hurt her." "But you didn't throw her out." "No, I didn't. I saw something in her that they couldn't see. Strength, courage, the willingness to work hard even when things were difficult. I gave her a job and she earned every penny I paid her. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with her." "So the joke didn't work," Samuel said, understanding dawning on his face. "Oh, it worked," Cole corrected with a grin. "Just not the way they intended. They meant to hurt your mother, but instead they delivered her to exactly where she needed to be. The joke was on them in the end. Samuel thought about this for a moment, then nodded with the wisdom of youth. Good. Ma's the best person I know. Those girls were stupid to be mean to her. They were, Cole agreed. But people do stupid things when they're scared or unhappy. Your mother taught me that the best revenge isn't cruelty in return. It's building a life so good that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch and the family gathered for dinner, Rosie looked around the table at the life she'd built. Her husband, still gruff but endlessly loving. Her children, healthy and happy, and learning to be kind in a world that wasn't always kind in return. The home they'd created together, full of laughter and warmth and honest work. She thought about the scared 18-year-old girl who'd walked up this road 16 years ago, sent as a joke, expecting nothing but humiliation. She thought about how close she'd come to a very different life, one of continued suffering and powerlessness, of making herself small and hoping not to be noticed. But she'd chosen differently. She'd chosen to be brave even when she was terrified. She'd chosen to work hard even when her hands bled. She'd chosen to stand up for herself even when it would have been easier to stay silent. And most importantly, she'd chosen to accept love when it was offered, even though accepting it meant risking being hurt. Those choices had made all the difference. "What are you thinking about?" Cole asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. "About how grateful I am," Rosie said simply, "for all of it. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts because they led me here." Cole squeezed her hand, understanding immediately what she meant. They'd both traveled through darkness to find each other. They'd both been broken and had learned to heal. And in choosing each other, they'd created something that transcended their individual pains. A family, a home, a love story that began with cruelty but ended with grace. The joke that was meant to destroy Rosie Carter had instead transformed her into Rosie Maddox, wife, mother, partner, survivor. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest revenge of all. Not because it hurt those who'd tried to hurt her, but because it proved that their cruelty had no lasting power over her happiness. She'd walk through their joke and come out the other side stronger, braver, loved. She'd turn their weapon into her salvation, their punchline into her triumph. And as she sat at her table surrounded by the family she'd built with the man they'd sent her to as a prank, Rosie Carter Maddox smiled and knew with absolute certainty that she'd won. Not by defeating them, but by becoming so completely happy that their opinions no longer mattered. The cruel joke had become the foundation of the most beautiful life she could have imagined. And that, in the end, was the best possible ending to a story that began with such heartache and humiliation. The ranch continued on, generation after generation, the story of how Cole and Rosie met becoming family legend. Their children told it to their children, who told it to theirs, and each time the moral remained the same. Cruelty has no lasting power over those who choose courage, and love can bloom in the most unlikely places if you're brave enough to let it. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the stars came out over the Colorado plains, you could almost hear the echo of laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the joyful sound of two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from the ashes of a cruel joke. The end.